Before clicking on this video, you might have been surprised and said, wow, that's a long video, especially if you didn't see my post the other day. And I wouldn't blame you for that. Most of my videos are between 8 to 15 minutes long, and a couple have breached 20. There's a reason for that. The longer the video, the harder it is for me, and quite honestly, the harder it is for you. After all, we're all busy, and expecting someone to watch the same video for such a long time can be quite an ask. As a result, I often cut things from my script, information that maybe isn't completely relevant, or information that would provide further context to a topic or statement, but isn't necessary for the video. I don't really like doing this. Of the creation process, writing the script is by far my favourite part, even though it can sometimes be frustrating when I ramble or lose track of what I'm talking about. So for this extra long video, I'm trying something new, something that will make it easier for both of us perhaps. Instead of demanding your attention, I want you to treat this video as something of a podcast, a video you can listen to while you do something else. And for myself, this video will allow me to focus on what I truly enjoy about the creation process, the writing. So in this video, I present to you the full history of the Kingdom of Rohan, from beginning to end, no cuts, no skips, nothing left out to the best of my ability. As far as the long years of Middle-earth are concerned, Rohan is a relatively new kingdom. By the time of the War of the Ring, it has existed for 500 years. In our own world, a kingdom lasting that long would be a long-lived kingdom indeed. But in Middle-earth, Rohan has only been the home of the Rohirrim for a short amount of time, and in fact, the Rohirrim have only been called the Rohirrim for a short amount of time. In the centuries and millennia prior, they have had many different names, many different homelands. But some things have always remained the same: their valor, their loyalty, and their resourcefulness. What we know about the First Age is mostly centered on the region of Beleriand, where the Elves and the Edain, those three houses of men who rejected the darkness, fought a long war against Morgoth. But elsewhere, Middle-earth was not the dire, grim place that Beleriand became. It was abuzz with the wanderings of many ancient peoples, elves, dwarves, Ents even. But most importantly, it was home to many groups of wandering men. Our main focus in this video is a large group of men who settled in the diverse landscapes between the Sea of Rhûn in the east and the Misty Mountains in the west, a group of men who would later be known as the Northmen. The Northmen were aptly named. They were mostly found in the northern regions of Middle-earth. They would settle in the plains of Rhovanion, the Vales of Anduin, the forest of Greenwood the Great, and in the valleys beneath the Grey Mountains. Some would make their way into Eotheod, some would move south where they would later meet resistance from other pre-Númenórean groups, and a smaller group that would be known as the House of Hador would make their way to Beleriand, where they would settle in the region of Dor-lómin. They were easily identifiable. They were fair-haired, fair-skinned, and were often taller than other men, at least in those early days. I don't want to spend ridiculously long talking about this early history, because it's the same for most of the men and kingdoms who claim descent from the Edain, and to be honest, we don't actually know a huge amount, because the Northmen relied mostly on oral history, and much of that oral history was later lost. In the case of these early Northmen, while the Edain would suffer and nearly perish in Beleriand, they would flourish across the northern lands of Rhovanion. They would learn agriculture from the Avari, the Dark Elves, and they would form something of an alliance with the Dwarves, who would teach them the arts of metalwork and stonework. In exchange, the Northmen would provide them military support. They were strong, valiant, and outnumbered the Dwarves, and they would also provide them grown food. The Dwarves did not like doing this themselves. This truly was something of a golden age for these men. Primitive though they might have been by later standards, dwelling in wooden villages and forming no nations or kingdoms. It's funny when you think about it, the Edain would have remembered the First Age as a time of suffering and despair, but the Northmen would have remembered it as their best years, when they had little to fear. Unfortunately for the Northmen, nothing lasts forever. This golden age would continue right through until the middle of the Second Age, when a monumental event called the War of the Elves and Sauron took place. This war is most known for the events that took place in Eotheod, the sack of Eregion, and the death of Celebrimbor, the near-total victory of Sauron before the triumphant arrival of the Númenóreans, who crushed him decisively across multiple battles. It was a war that would leave Eriador in ruins, and it would take many years for it to recover. What's less known about this war is that there was a second front. I mean, if you could call it a second front. As Sauron's main forces ravaged Eriador, some of his forces, mostly made up of men from the east, washed across the lands of Rhovanion. The elves in Greenwood and Lorinand dared not leave their lands. The dwarves were at first occupied in the west, and then they began to close their gates. The Northmen of Rhovanion, although numerous, were weak when it came to the art of war. They had no kingdoms, no strongholds, their weapons were crude, their armour non-existent. Thus, when Sauron's forces arrived, they could do little except die. By the time the war was over, and Sauron had been forced back into Mordor, the Northmen had effectively been subjected to a genocide, and few of them remained. These few had only survived because they had abandoned their wooden settlements and fertile valleys, withdrawing deep into the forests or hiding in caves within the mountains. Their settlements were not the only things that were abandoned. The Northmen themselves were abandoned by the dwarves, who decided to isolate themselves in their mountain halls. I don't think the dwarves should be especially blamed for this. Policies of isolation had been common throughout the First Age, not just from them, but from men and elves too. Not only were the Northmen alone, but now they were at the mercy of two rising powers, neither of whom cared for the men of Middle-earth. In the south, an increasingly darkening Numenor began to subjugate the coastal lands, often driving away the indigenous men who dwelt there. In an attempt to match them, Sauron continued carving out his own dominion in the interior of Middle-earth, and his subject peoples were all too eager to carry out his will. Throughout the rest of the Second Age, men from the east would plunge deeper into Rhovanion. For the Northmen, this was a dark age. Generation after generation would have grown up in an increasingly darkening world, where one was either at the mercy of Sauron and his servants, or a Numenor that had fallen under shadow. Many of those Northmen who remained were likely enslaved by Sauron's servants, and those who managed to escape that fate probably lived in constant fear, unsure of when their home and their way of life would fall victim to some greater power. Some tried to flee or migrate. The odd little tale of Tal Elmar suggests that a group of migrating Northmen were destroyed by a coalition of pre-Numenorians who served Sauron. One Northman woman who was captured after the battle was the grandmother of the titular character of Tal Elmar. For the better part of 2,000 years, 4 times longer than the known history of Rohan, this nightmare continued, and for a people who had no written language, no records, it would have seemed like a nightmare that would never end. But it did end. In the final years of the Second Age, Numenor would destroy itself, giving rise to the realms in exile, inhabited by the faithful Numenorians who were much kinder to the natives of Middle-earth, which isn't exactly a high bar, given the Numenorians were enslaving and sacrificing people by the end. 100 years later, the titanic struggle that would be known as the War of the Last Alliance would result in Sauron's defeat. It's never explicitly stated that the Northmen fought in this war, but it wouldn't be out of the question that some joined up and marched south and got their revenge. With Sauron defeated, his power would shatter, and those Northmen that had lived under the yoke of his servants would finally have some breathing space. Now, before I continue, I want to go into greater depth about the situation of the Northmen during this time. Like I said earlier, we don't know much about the Northmen during the First Age, but given the short time span of their existence, not even 600 years, and the fact that there was little to no geographical isolation, it could be assumed that there was little cultural and linguistical divergence. This changed after the dark years of the Second Age. Sauron's war had left large swathes of Rhovanion severely depopulated or even entirely uninhabited. As a result, those groups of Northmen that survived ended up developing in isolation from each other, and thus they began to form their own distinct cultures. Unfortunately, we don't know too much about some of these cultures, but they fit into neat little categories. If they were different nations in a game of civilization, they would probably play totally differently. In the vales between Greenwood and the Misty Mountains, we have the Vale Men, and their forested neighbours, the Woodmen. These guys are more traditional, less civilized you could say. They live in small communities, sometimes follow local chiefs. They're tough, but don't get involved in the big events too often. In the north, above the river Celduin, we have the Dalemen, or Proto-Dalemen as I've called them in the past, as Dale was founded a long time after. These men are traders and diplomats. They form connections with the dwarves, the elves, they trade down their rivers, and they form larger settlements that could be called towns or cities. But our main focus at the moment is the Northmen who ended up living between the Sea of Rhûn and Greenwood. These men are the men of Rhovanion, but they're mostly just referred to as the Northmen. These are the men who were the main ancestors of the Rohirrim, and you can already see the similarities over 2,000 years before the founding of Rohan. These men are warlike, valiant, loyal. They don't really build cities, but they do build large halls and stables that can accommodate many. And, I just spoke about the stables, so it shouldn't come as a surprise that these men love horses, and their armies were largely cavalry-based. So in the beginning of the Third Age, these men of Rhovanion gain in strength, and this is aided by the fact that Gondor drives back the Easterlings in the 7th century, creating a buffer between these Northmen and their ancient rivals. We don't know much about what the men of Rhovanion were doing during this time. Remember, a lot of our insight into Middle-earth comes from Gondorian scholars and historians, so we only have fragments when it comes to the Northmen. The Gondorians undoubtedly knew of the Northmen, and even showed them favour in the early years of the Third Age, but the Northmen don't truly become part of the story until the 13th century. In the 13th century, Gondor was still at the height of its power and territorial extent, but cracks were beginning to form. Jarmendikel I had been a mighty man, but his son, Eotheod II Alcuin, was lazy and did little to maintain the vast empire he had inherited. His sons, Narmakil I and Calmakil, were similar to their father, and thus it seemed like Gondor was destined to crumble in the hands of decadent rulers. But Narmakil had the good sense at least to make his nephew, Minelkar, the regent of Gondor. You might know him by another name, Romendikil II, who would go on to become one of Gondor's greatest kings. From about the 9th century to the middle of the 11th century, Gondor had been embroiled in wars to the south, and during that time, its eastern frontier had slowly eroded away. Minelkar was aware of this, but more alarming for him was the situation with the Northmen. Now, by this point in time, the men of Rhovanion were quite powerful, but they were not a united force. Instead, the Northmen were ruled by various princes, all with their own agendas, and while they were generally friendly with Gondor, they were not all friendly with each other. Some were even not above siding with Easterlings to fight their own kin, and this concerned Minelkar because sometimes in order to earn favour with the Easterlings, the Northmen would also raid Gondorian territory. And let's be clear, sometimes they would also do it because they wanted loot and glory. Minelkar was determined to remove this problem at its source. After all, the Northmen could not side with the Easterlings if there were no Easterlings. So Minelkar marched an army east in 1248 and smashed the Easterlings to pieces, taking the name Romendikil II, East Conqueror. In this endeavour, Romendikil had the aid of a very important Northman who was known by the name of Vidurgavia. Fun fact, by the time of the War of the Ring, Denethor, Theoden, and Aragorn could all count this man as an ancestor. Anyway, Vidurgavia was a powerful man in Rhovanion, even claiming to be the King of Rhovanion. Whether that was entirely true or not is unknown, but regardless, he would have been even more powerful following his alliance with Romendikil, and from that point on, the Northmen were firmly allied with Gondor, many of them even relocating south and serving in Gondor's armies, filling the gaps in Gondor's manpower. To further cement this alliance, Romendikil sent his son, Valakar, to stay with the Northmen for a while. This led to something that Romendikil did not predict. Valakar would end up marrying the daughter of Vidurgavia, Vidumarvi, and together they would have a son, Eldakar or Winithaya in the language of the Northmen. Many Gondorians, especially those in the southern regions, did not look upon this union favourably, as it was believed that the Númenorian blood of the kings would now be watered down. In fact, there was already some resentment against the Northmen who now lived in Gondor or served in its armies, as they were viewed as lesser men. Romendikil feared where this would lead, but could do little but recall Valakar. He could not annul the marriage or disinherit Eldakar, as that would jeopardize the alliance with the Northmen. As Romendikil feared, this problem would not go away, especially as the reign of Valakar progressed. Many of the fears of the traditionalists ended up being false. Eldacar showed no signs of being lesser than his ancestors, and he showed no signs of aging any quicker. Still, upon Valakar's death, civil war would erupt in Gondor, the traditionalists being led by Castamir, a distant cousin to the king and captain of the ships. Eldacar would cling onto his throne for 5 years, but he was eventually forced to flee to Rhovanion after being driven from Osgiliath. The city was sacked by Castamir, and Ornendil, Eldacar's eldest son, was captured and executed. In 1447, Eldacar would return to Gondor, leading an army of Northmen and Loyalists, and at the Battle of Eorl, Eldacar killed Castamir and reclaimed his throne. I just want to point out the loyalty of the Northmen here. Although it was in their best interest to support a Gondor that was pro-Northman, the fact that they were so loyal to Eldacar was fascinating. He was half Northman, but by the time he fled north, his Northman mother had been dead for over 100 years. The legendary Vidugavia had been dead for over 150 years. Eldacar would have been dealing with the grandchildren or even great-grandchildren of his uncles and aunts. This conflict secured the alliance between Gondor and the Northmen even further, as the Gondorians who supported Castamir, many of them racial supremacists, were either destroyed or fled south to Umbar. That being said, the Northmen mostly disappear from the history books for the next 200 years, years where they may have supported Gondor in their wars in the south, but we have no concrete evidence. Unfortunately, these 200 years were the final years of the Golden Age for the Northmen of Rhovanion, for their next enemy was an enemy that they could not fight with weapons and valour. This enemy was the Great Plague, which first appeared out of Rhûn in 1635. Presumably carried by refugees fleeing west or perhaps merchants, the plague reached Rhovanion in a particularly harsh winter. Now, you'd think that during a harsh winter where travel was limited, a plague would not do too much damage, but in actuality, the Northmen did travel a lot during winter. As stated earlier, they didn't build large cities, and many of them were semi-nomadic herdsmen who had to take shelter during the harsher weather. As a result, the halls and stables of the Northmen were packed with those trying to wait out the weather, some of whom carried the plague with them. The end result was utterly devastating, and it would have been a terrifying time to be alive. These halls, packed with people, would have erupted with terror as many started to fall sick and then die from the plague. Treatment was barely an option, as the Northmen were not as skilled at the art of healing as their Gondorian allies. Those healthy enough to travel would have been faced with two options: stay and risk the plague, or flee and risk the cold. In many cases, you can imagine those who risked the cold were already infected, bringing the plague along with them to their next shelter, or simply freezing to death when their bodies became too weak. It was an apocalyptic winter, and by the time it and the plague had passed, at least 50% of the population of Rhovanion had perished, including half of their horses. Fortunately for the men of Rhovanion, many of their enemies in the east had also suffered from the plague, and were thus in no condition to immediately begin waging war. Unfortunately for the men of Rhovanion, this would not save them. In 1851, 214 years after the plague had ended, yet another new enemy arrived on the doorstep of Rhovanion. These were the Wainriders, a confederation of semi-nomadic Easterlings, better armed and better trained than any of their predecessors, named because their chieftains often rode in great chariots. I've done a full video on the Wainriders, you should check it out if you haven't. For 5 years, the Wainriders and the Northmen battled. By 1856, the situation had become dire for the Northmen, so they called upon Gondor for aid. Gondor, now under Narmakil II, had once again been fighting wars in the south, and shifting their focus to the northeast ended up costing them the port city of Umbar, which had been under their control for the last 50 years. Narmakil gathered an army and marched north to the land south of Mirkwood. There, his army met with the remnants of the Northman armies, led by a man named Mahari, who was a descendant of the ancient king Vidugavia. On the plains south of Mirkwood, battle was met between Gondor and the Wainriders. The battle was a bloody affair, with massive losses on both sides, but the Wainriders emerged the victors. Narmakil II fell on the battlefield, and Gondor's retreat threatened to turn into a rout. But Mahari and his Northmen held the rear guard, and although Mahari would fall during the fighting, Their bravery and sacrifice allowed the Gondorian army to avoid total destruction. The Wainriders suffered heavy losses during the fighting themselves, and lacked the strength to press into Gondor, so they turned north and consolidated their gains in Rhovanion. This was the end of the Kingdom of Rhovanion, the second Northman Golden Age, conquered by the Wainrider Easterlings. The fates of the Northmen who survived the war differed. There were some who fled north over the Celduin, where they would merge with their kin who would go on to become the Men of Dale. Despite their newfound geographical proximity to the Wainriders, to the best of our knowledge, they managed to avoid the rest of the war. Some fled to Gondor, which had been accepting Northmen into their lands for around 600 years at this point. The greater part remained in Rhovanion, either unable or unwilling to flee, and they were brutally enslaved by the Wainriders. But the group that interests us most was a small group led by Mahwini, the son of Mahari. This group fled south, and then west, and then finally north between the Anduin and the Forest of Mirkwood. They would settle in the Vales of Anduin near to the Gladden Fields, merging with other Northmen who had called the Vales their home for millennia. Over the next few decades, they would be joined by more refugees from Rhovanion, many of whom were forced to flee through Mirkwood to escape their subjugators. This group would come to be known as the Eotheod. Interestingly, King Kalimatar, who took the throne of Gondor after the untimely death of his father, was not aware of this group of Northmen who escaped. When contact was re-established around 40 years later, both Kalimatar and Mahwini realized they had similar goals. Mahwini was not about to abandon his homeland without one final fight, but he would need a powerful ally, and Kalimatar, eager to avenge his father and punish the Wainriders, was happy to help. Mahwini planned for a great uprising in Rhovanion and had secretly been sending agitators into Mirkwood to make it happen. But an uprising had no chance of success if the main Wainrider army had not been dealt with first. At any event, the Wainriders, unaware of the plans of Gondor and the Eotheod, were intent on making the first move, and through his spies, Mahwini learned that they were planning an invasion of Calanadon. Kalimatar decided to strike first, hastily assembling an army and marching north out of Ithilien. The Wainriders took the bait. Unaware that Gondorian horsemen had crossed the Undeeps, meeting with a force of Eotheod led by Mahwini. To give his cavalry time, Kalimatar then retreated, drawing the Wainriders onto the plain of Daggerlad. There a battle ensued, and its outcome was in doubt, until the cavalry arrived and smashed into the flank of the Wainriders. The Wainriders fled in disarray, losing a third of their force upon Daggerlad, and many more were killed as the Eotheod harried the retreating survivors. Unfortunately for Mahwini, this victory was not the total victory he was hoping for. The uprising in Rhovanion erupted as planned. As soon as the Wainrider army left, Mahwini's men roused the enslaved Northmen, inspiring them to revolt. But it didn't get much better than that for the Northmen. Although they did manage to burn many of the dwellings, storehouses, and wagons of the Wainriders, most of them perished in the fighting. This was because they were mostly poorly armed, and although most of the Wainriders' warriors were away, they were a martial culture. The old and the young were still capable warriors, as were the women. If 1856 was the death of Rhovanion, then 1899 was the funeral. Although some Northmen still remained in those lands for another 600 years, they were often subjugated or at the mercy of the various Easterling groups. As for Mahwini, he was forced to retire to the Vales of Anduin, and his Eotheod would never again return to their ancestral lands beyond Mirkwood. As for the Wainriders, they were bloodied but not beaten, and the Eotheod had a part to play in the final phase of the war. Following their defeat on Daggerlad, the Wainriders would summon more of their kinsmen from the east, and they would forge alliances with some of the men of Harad and Khand, planning on a two-pronged assault against Gondor that would end it once and for all. This information was made known to Gondor through the spies of Forthwini, the son of Mahwini, and sure enough, in 1944, they began their invasion, forcing Gondor to split their forces into two armies, a northern army led by King Ondahur, and a southern army led by General Earnil. The part the Eotheod played in this final phase of the war is unclear. We know some of their forces joined with Ondahur's northern army, led by a commander whose name started with Mah, so not Forthwini, and given Mahwini was almost certainly dead by this point, It may have been Forfuini's brother or son. What we do know is that Ondaha's youngest son, Faramir, who had been ordered to remain at home, disguised himself as one of the Eotheod and joined the battle. Said battle, the disaster at the Morannon, was, believe it or not, a disaster. Ondaha and his heir, Artamir, were killed in the initial assault by the Wainriders, and Faramir was killed shortly afterwards. At least some of the Eotheod, including their commander, survived the initial battle and were with the Gondorian general Minotaur as he retreated into Ithilien. As history goes, Gondor would see a reversal of fortunes. General Eärnil was victorious against the Haradrim, and he would ambush the Wainriders in Ithilien, utterly destroying them. The Wainrider Confederacy seems to have disintegrated shortly afterwards, and although the Easterlings would remain on the east side of the Anduin, they would no longer be considered a major threat for years to come. But for the Eotheod, it seems that reclaiming their old homeland was still beyond their strength. The Easterling threat was ever present, and they feared the dark power that resided in Dol Guldur. Even centuries later, the Eotheod would still long to return to their ancient home, stories of it passed down from generation to generation. This would not be the final time that the Eotheod would aid Gondor, and for the first time, the Eotheod would find their warriors travelling west instead of east. In 1974, King Arvedui of Arthedain calls upon Gondor for aid, seeing that Angmar's final hammer blow is imminent. Gondor responds, but is too late. Arthedain falls in the winter of that year, and the Witch King takes Fornost as his seat. In 1975, Gondor's army, which includes Eotheod horsemen, is the main force that participates in the Battle of Fornost against the forces of Angmar. The Eotheod pull off a classical flanking maneuver, smashing into Angmar's forces as they're retreating across the fields towards Fornost, utterly destroying them. It is perhaps this expedition against Angmar that inspires the Eotheod to make their next move. In the northern vales of Anduin, Angmar's influence actually spread across the mountains, and some of their people lived in the lands between the Misty Mountains and the river Greylin. The Eotheod, now led by Frumgar, who was either the son or grandson of Forfuini, decided that a move was necessary. The lands between the Gladden Fields and the Carrock weren't suitable for the Eotheod's horses, and were now growing overpopulated because many Northmen had already lived there before the Eotheod arrived. On top of that, the dark power in Dol Guldur concerned the Eotheod, and they wished to be away from it. Thus, Angmar's eastern territories were the target, and the Eotheod succeeded in conquering them and driving away Angmar's last subjects in 1977. Their new territories were marked as the Misty Mountains in the west, the Forest River in the east, the Grey Mountains in the north, and the River Langwell in the south. Unfortunately, this move had unforeseen consequences. With their move to the north, the Eotheod now lived 450 miles from Gondor's sparsely populated border at the Limelight, and 800 miles from Minas Tirith, or a little under 1,300 kilometers. And this was as the bird flies, so the actual journey would be far longer. As a result, it was rare for messengers to pass between Minas Tirith and the Eotheod capital, a fortress later named Framsburg, at the confluence of the Greylin and the Langwell. This concerned the Gondorians, who were obviously quite aware how important the Northmen and the Eotheod had been in their wars. Fortunately, the need for messages would be lessened with the coming of the Watchful Peace in 2063, but the lack of messages would only lead to further estrangement, at least so the stewards of Gondor believed. And the estrangement damages our own story. As I said earlier, our knowledge of the Northmen and the Eotheod comes from Gondorian historians. Thus, after Frumgar, we only know of one more lord of the Eotheod for centuries, and that's Frumgar's son, Fram. You may have heard of Fram because he's something of a legendary figure. According to the legends, a dragon named Scaffa was wreaking havoc in the Grey Mountains until Fram slew him, claiming his hoard of treasures for the Eotheod. Apparently, the dwarves who lived in the Grey Mountains claimed that Scaffa's treasures rightfully belonged to them. Fram responded by sending them a necklace of Scaffa's teeth, stating that they were far more valuable than any of the treasures due to how difficult they were to obtain. The dwarves perceived this as an insult, and as the legend goes, they killed Fram. Like I said, whether this is all true or not is unknown. The Eotheod never kept written records, and the dwarves were rather secretive when it came to their own. But after Fram, we enter a historical blind spot of almost 500 years. Pretty much all the actions of the Eotheod are unknown during this time. But what we do know is that when the Eotheod emerge back onto the stage in the late 25th century, they have once again become powerful. So powerful that their lands in the north are struggling to contain them. Evidently, the Watchful Peace must have been a prosperous period for them. At this time, the Eotheod are ruled by a man named Leone, who is a descendant of Fram. Not much is known about Leone except that he was apparently a legendary horseman. Ironically for Leone, his love of horses ends up being his undoing. In 2501, Leone attempts to tame a particularly famous wild horse, but is thrown from it, his head striking a rock, killing him instantly. At the time of his death, Leone was only 42, so his son and heir, Eorl, was only 16 when he took over the lordship of the Eotheod, hence why he is often known as Eorl the Young. Eorl's first deed as lord was to hunt down the horse that had killed his father and tame it. This he did, and he named the horse Felaroth, meaning Mansbane. Felaroth would be the first of the Mayoras, a legendary lineage of horses in Rohan from which Shadowfax was descended. Unfortunately for Eorl, he did not have the time to slowly ease into the role. Away from the Eotheod, the world was rapidly changing again. In 2460, the Watchful Peace came to an end. Orc activity increased in the Misty Mountains, and in the south, Gondor found itself facing attacks from Mordor and Minas Morgul. But in the years following Eorl's succession, a new major threat was building to the east. Earlier in the story, I mentioned that the Wainwriter Confederation had disintegrated, but their descendants hadn't simply gone away. The lands east of the Anduin remained home to many Easterlings, and one of these groups, known as the Balcoff, had risen to power before the year of 2510. Worth noting that Balcoff just means horrible horde in Sindarin. It wasn't what these men called themselves. And a horde they were. Unlike the Wainwriters before them, they weren't heavily armed and they lacked horsemen, but they made up for these deficiencies with sheer numbers. Their first victims, rather unfortunately, were the remnants of those Northmen who lived in the lands that once belonged to the Kingdom of Rhovanion. But the Balcoff weren't intending on stopping there, and began to raid up the Vales of Anduin, driving the Valemen before them. Soon enough, the lands south of the Gladden Fields were totally uninhabited, and then they turned their attention on Gondor, specifically the wide, flat region of Calenadon. Steward Kirion was aware of this, having regarrisoned the Undeeps specifically to keep an eye on the activity of the Balcoff. Needless to say, this new development was incredibly concerning for Gondor. Calenadon had been depopulated over the centuries, so it was of little economic or cultural importance to Gondor, but its geographic location meant that if it was taken, it would put enemies on Gondor's northern flank and on the other side of Gondor's greatest natural barrier, the Anduin. Although the Watchful Peace allowed for Gondor to recover some of its strength, the renewed threat from Mordor and the ever-present threats from the south meant that Gondor was stretched too thin to muster its full might against the Balcoff. Thus, Steward Kirion turned his thoughts towards the distant Eotheod and resolved to send them messages pleading for aid against the Balcoff. But the task of getting a message to the Eotheod would be far from easy. It was an almost 1,000-mile journey, and to make matters worse, the Balcoff controlled the entire eastern bank of the Anduin between the Undeeps and the Gladden Fields, meaning riders would have to pass through enemy-controlled territory. To maximize the chance of getting a message through, Kirion selected 6 riders, 3 pairs who would leave across separate days. But even if a rider should get through, Kirion did not know if the Eotheod would even come to Gondor's aid. It had been 500 years since the two nations had ridden to war together, and contact between them had been infrequent. Kirion knew of Eorl, and had heard that he was brave and wise beyond these years, but there's no evidence of personal correspondence between them at this point. Kirion tried to give weight to the message by informing Eorl that the Balcoff were destroying the remnants of their ancient kin in Rhovanion, but in reality, the success of the plea depended heavily on whether Eorl saw the merit in honouring an ancient alliance. Unable to do any more, Kirion gathered Gondor's northern army at Minas Tirith and prepared to march north. The first pair of messengers set out from Minas Tirith on the 10th of March, The second and third pairs set out on the following 2 days. Of these 3 pairs, only the first pair found success. The other two's fates are unknown. They were presumably killed or captured by the Balkov. And of the first pair, only one member survived. The other was killed by arrows in an ambush near to the eaves of Mirkwood. This lone survivor was a man named Borondir, a Gondorian whose family claimed descent from a great Northman captain who once served in Gondor. Borondir escaped the ambush that killed his companion thanks to luck and the speed of his horse. He was pursued as far north as the Gladden Fields, and was constantly waylaid by hostile men who emerged from Mirkwood. He reached the Eotheod on the 25th of March, exhausted and barely able to speak, the last 2 days of his journey spent without food. Contrary to Kirion's fears, Eorl took mere moments to reach a decision, stating that if Mundberg fell, to where could the Eotheod flee from the darkness? Mundberg being a Northman name for Minas Tirith. Although Eorl's decision was quick, the mustering of the Eotheod was not. This wasn't like Theoden mustering the Rohirrim in 3 days several centuries later. At this time, the Eotheod were at peace, and as far as we know, had been for quite a while. It took time to gather warriors from all corners of the land, and to organise a defensive force for while the bulk of the soldiers were away. 12 days later, Eorl had his army, 7,000 heavily armed riders, and several hundred mounted archers. Eorl would only leave behind a few hundred warriors to defend, supplemented by the old and the young. Eorl's belief was that if Gondor fell, the Eotheod would be doomed anyway, so there was no use in leaving many men behind. When the Eotheod left, they had no idea what was awaiting them in the south. Borondir rides alongside Eorl as a guide, but the land he had been pursued through only the month earlier was now completely empty. And what groups of men they did come across, whether they be friend or foe, hid from sight of such a large army. The reason for the lack of Balkov is easily explained. The Gondorian army, led by Kirion himself, moved into Calenadon, but by the time it arrived, much of the region had already been overrun by the Balkov. The 2 armies met in the Wold, but heavily outnumbered, Kirion found himself outmatched, was cut off from the south, and was forced to retreat northwards across the Limelight. If not for a bridge that had been built there by Gondorians in days past, they might have been slaughtered against the river, and Middle-earth would have turned out a vastly different place. But crossing the Limelight did not give the Gondorian army safe haven. Instead, they were suddenly assaulted from behind by an army of orcs descending from the Misty Mountains. Whether this was planned or simply a coincidence, we will never know, but now the Gondorians were being driven back into a narrow strip of land between the Limelight and the Anduin. It was now the 15th of April, and with no sign of the Eotheod, all seemed lost. And perhaps the Eotheod would not have arrived in time, if not for the help of Galadriel. As the Eotheod passed near Lothlorien, the path before them was suddenly shrouded in mist, warding off the darkness from nearby Dol Guldur. Unlike the Gondorians, the Eotheod were wary of elves, and Lothlorien, known to them as the Dwimadine, had an ill reputation. Nonetheless, Eorl ordered them forward into the mist, which turned out to be far from normal mist. It not only hid the army from sight, it deafened the sound of the horses' hooves, and seemingly reinvigorated them. For 2 whole days, the army rode through the mist, and on the dawn of the 3rd day, they were surprised to find themselves already at the Undeeps. Eorl's army had managed to ride over 500 miles in just 9 days. As it turns out, they arrived not a moment too soon. They smashed into the rear of the enemy, saving the Gondorians and driving the Balkov back over the Limelight with great slaughter. Those Balkov that survived the Battle of the Field of Celebrant, as it was known, sought safety with their brethren that had remained behind in Calenadon, but this simply caused a mass panic. Those that survived brought news of a massive army of horsemen that had unexpectedly arrived from the north, and this tale alone was enough to break any resistance that remained. When Eorl and his men arrived in close pursuit, they had little trouble in hunting down the scattering bands of Balkov that remained. Unfortunately, the victory was somewhat bittersweet. Borondir, the heroic messenger who had made it through to the Eotheod and then led them south, fell in battle defending Kirion. Kirion marched south with his battered army, accompanied by Eorl and an aered of his soldiers. That's a company of 120 men, by the way. There was a lot of speculation as to how Kirion would reward the Eotheod. After all, they had saved Kirion and his army from certain destruction, without promise of reward, when they could have just stayed in the north. But Kirion was a private man. At the Mering Stream, which formed the border that separated the provinces of Eorl and Calanadon, Kirion simply told Eorl that they would meet at this spot in 3 months' time. In the meantime, he entrusted Calanadon to Eorl's care, provided Eorl wasn't overly eager to return home. Eorl agreed, and they parted ways. 3 months later, the two meet again. Eorl was accompanied by 3 of his chief captains, and Kirion by his son, Halas, the unnamed Lord of Dol Amroth, and 2 other of his councillors. Kirion led the company to a nearby hill, known as Amon Anwar. At the foot of the stairs that led to the summit of the hill, Kirion said this: "I will now declare what I have resolved, with the authority of the stewards of the kings, to offer to Eorl, son of Leod, Lord of the Eotheod, in recognition of the valour of his people and of the help beyond hope that he brought to Gondor in time of dire need. To Eorl I will give in free gift all the great land of Calanadon, from Anduin to Isen. There, if he will, he shall be king, and his heirs after him, and his people shall dwell in freedom while the authority of the stewards endures, until the great king returns. No bond shall be laid upon them, other than their own laws and will, save in this only: they shall live in perpetual friendship with Gondor, and its enemies shall be their enemies while both realms endure. But the same bond shall be laid also on the people of Gondor." These words stunned Eorl, and he could only stand in silence for a while. Not only was Calanadon a generous gift, but it was also a problem solver for the Eotheod. Their lands in the north had grown too small for their people, and although they still wished to return to Rhovanion, they feared the shadow that had fallen upon Mirkwood. In Calanadon they could have a wide, fertile land, with plenty of space for the people, and plenty more for the horses. It was far from Dol Guldur, and protected by rivers and mountains on all sides. But there was something deeper than all this, a bond between the peoples of Gondor and that of the Northmen, and on a personal level, a bond between Kirion and Eorl. The 61-year-old Kirion looked upon Eorl as a strong son, and the 25-year-old Eorl looked upon Kirion as a wise father. Thus Eorl accepted the gift, though with humbleness and thoughtfulness. "Lord Steward of the Great King, the gift that yon offer I accept for myself and for my people. It far exceeds any reward that our deeds could have earned, if they had not themselves been a free gift of friendship. But now I will seal that friendship with an oath that shall not be forgotten." The company then ascended to the top of the hill, flat except for a small mound that was marked with a single black stone. Reading the words upon the stone, the Lord of Dol Amroth is confused. That's because the stone marks the tomb of Elendil, a closely guarded secret that only a few living men knew at any time. Kirion reveals that this is why he chose Amon Anwar as the spot for oath-taking, a hallowed place with great significance to Gondor. At this spot, Eorl draws his sword and gives his oath in the tongue of the Eotheod. Translated to Westron, it reads like this: "Hear now, all peoples who bow not to the shadow in the east. By the gift of the Lord of the Mundburg, we will come to dwell in the land that he names Calanadon, and therefore I vow in my own name and on behalf of the Eotheod of the north that between us and the great people of the west there shall be friendship forever. Their enemies shall be our enemies, their need shall be our need, and whatsoever evil or threat or assault may come upon them, we will aid them to the utmost end of our strength. This vow shall descend to my heirs, all such as may come after me in our new land, and let them keep it in faith unbroken, lest the shadow fall upon them and they become accursed." To this, Kirion responds in Quenya, but he repeats himself in Westron. "This oath shall stand in memory of the glory of the land of the star, and of the faith of Elendil the faithful, in the keeping of those who sit upon the thrones of the west, and of the one who is above all thrones forever." This is a very serious oath. The company then left as darkness was falling, and came back to the camp by the Mering Stream. Tents had been prepared, and after a meal, Eorl and his chief captain, Eamund, got together with Kirion and the Lord of Dol Amroth. They spent the evening defining the boundaries of Eorl's new realm, and some of the policies that it would maintain. I could explain the boundaries of Eorl's new realm, but I'll just let Tolkien do it as he does in the Unfinished Tales. The bounds of the realm of Eorl were to be: In the west, the River Angren from its junction with the Adorn, and thence northwards to the outer fences of Angrenost, and thence westwards and northwards along the eaves of Fangorn Forest to the River Limelight. And that river was its northern boundary, for the land beyond had never been claimed by Gondor. In the east, its bounds were the Anduin and the west cliff of the Emyn Muil, down to the marshes of the mouth of Anodlo, and beyond that river, the stream of the Glanhir that flowed through the wood of Anwar to join the Anodlo, and in the south, its bounds were the Ered Nimrace, as far as the end of their northward arm. But all those vales and inlets that opened northwards were to belong to the Eotheod, as well as the land south of Hefeglir that lay between the rivers Angren and Adorn. The only enclave of Calanadon that would remain in Gondorian control was the Forest of Angrenost, later known as Isengard. In these days, Angrenost was still garrisoned by Gondorians. Imagine me using air quotes when I say that, the reason why I'll get into a little later. These Gondorians had become a settled people, ruled by a hereditary captain, and they had mostly become ignorant to many of the events that concern the kingdom. But Angrenost contained the Tower of Orthanc, and Orthanc contained one of the Palantiri, and for that reason the keys to Orthanc would remain in the hands of the stewards, at least for a while longer. Although Eorl would not receive Angrenost, he would receive the fortress of Aglarond, later known as the Hornburg or Helm's Deep. The final matter was that of policy. Firstly, the Great Road would be open to all travellers without hindrance during times of peace, and that the maintenance of the section that ran through Calanadon would be the responsibility of the Eotheod. And lastly, Amon Anwar, which now sat on the border of both kingdoms, would be jointly maintained as a hallowed place. But in later days, as Gondor's power waned even further, this responsibility would mostly lie with the Rohirrim who dwelt in the Eastfold. Historically, the day of the oath-taking is regarded as the beginning of the Kingdom of Rohan, but interestingly enough, while it was the dawn of a new kingdom, the place was not yet known as Rohan, nor were the people known as the Rohirrim, just yet. In fact, these names were devised by Halas, son of Cirion, during his own reign, and Eorl was not known as the King of Rohan during his life. Cirion would, after all, outlive Eorl by a fair margin. Instead, Eorl was still known as the Lord of the Eotheod and as the King of Calanadon. Bloody hell, almost 50 minutes in and we're just getting to the history of Rohan proper. What a march. But Eorl's new kingdom would take time to establish. Taking leave of Cirion, Eorl left half of his army, as well as all of his mounted archers, to safekeep Calanadon. The rest of his force he would take north to his people, to act as an escort for the long journey south to their new lands. Unfortunately, we don't receive any details about this process, but I think we can safely assume that it took the Eotheod years to properly establish themselves in Rohan. Eorl himself built a capital on a green hill at the foot of the White Mountains, a town called Aldburg. Edoras would come later. It's also worth pointing out that despite their reputation for being lovers of horses and for maintaining great herds, most of the Rohirrim did not dwell in the open plains of Rohan. Instead, most dwelt in the fertile valleys of the White Mountains and the foothills between them, in the regions of the Westfold, the Eastfold, and the Fold. The bulk of Rohan's territory actually belonged to three regions known as the West Emnet, the East Emnet, and the Wold. But these three regions were sparsely populated, mostly being home to semi-nomadic herdsmen. The Rohirrim seem to have become a little more urbanized, but still did not build great cities, mostly dwelling in towns, villages, and farmsteads. The Peace of Rohan would not be won without bloodshed. There's evidence that the Easterlings, possibly even the Balkoth, continued their attacks following their defeat on the fields of Celebrant. We know this because in 2545, 35 years after the founding of Rohan, tragedy struck the Rohirrim. Eorl the Young was killed in battle in the Wold. He was aged 60, but it was said that he was still youthful, his yellow hair still hadn't turned grey. He would retroactively be known as the first King of Rohan and was buried in the first royal mound. His horse Felaroth was buried beside him. This left Rohan in the hands of the 33-year-old Brago, Eorl's only known child. He had been born in the year 2512, 2 years after the founding of Rohan, so he was amongst the first of a generation that had known no other home. Brago swiftly avenged his father, defeated the Easterlings again, and drove them from the wold. This defeat seems to have been significant enough for the Easterlings to avoid attacking Rohan for centuries to come. However, it was not the only conflict going on in Rohan during this time. In Rohan's west lived a people known as the Dunlendings, and thus would start a bitter feud that would last generations. I've done plenty of videos on the Dunlendings, but I will summarise them by saying that the Dunlendings hadn't had it easy throughout history, being wronged by both Númenóreans and Sauron. Throughout the Third Age, the Dunlendings, at least officially, had been subjects of Gondor, but contact between the Dunlendings and the Dunedain was minimal, and they both seemed content with letting the other be. But as Gondor waned and withdrew from Enedwaith, the Dunlendings began to spread, and as the Gondorian province of Calanadon became depopulated, the Dunlendings began to drift across the Adorn and the Isen, even mixing with the few Gondorians that remained in Calanadon's west. By the time the Rohirrim arrived, Dunlendings had been living in the western parts of Rohan for centuries, and almost immediately the two peoples did not get along. For obvious reasons, the Rohirrim saw the Dunlendings as barbarians that were illegally occupying their new lands, and the Dunlendings saw the Rohirrim as foreign invaders, calling them strawheads. Now, not all contact between these two peoples was hostile. They did mix to a certain degree, especially in places like the Westmarch, which I will definitely talk about later. But there were enough issues present that Brago's reign saw the beginning of a long, drawn-out ultimatum. The Dunlendings who lived in Rohan would subject themselves to the king, or leave, by force if necessary. And this was a rather one-sided affair in these early years. The Dunlendings don't give the impression that they were a united people, being made up of both hillmen from the hills of Dunland and herdsmen who lived in the plains below. There's no mention of them having a king, so when faced with a unified enemy, they were already at a disadvantage. They were also at a technological disadvantage. The Dunlendings were not very advanced when it came to metallurgy, and while the Rohirrim were not masters themselves, any shortcomings they had were made up by buying arms and armour from Gondor, who were the best remaining metalsmiths in Middle-earth with the exception of the dwarves and the few Noldor who remained. So in battle, the Dunlendings were armed with their own crude weapons, or anything better they could steal or salvage. The Rohirrim, armed with quality steel and chainmail. The only positive for the Dunlendings is that they had mounted soldiers of their own, but even they weren't really a match for the Rohirrim. Brago's reign also saw some big internal changes in Rohan. Sometime during his reign, Brago would order the construction of the Golden Hall of Meduseld, built above the town of Edoras. This was meant to be the new capital. Brago would also venture the wilderness in search of places that could be used as a refuge for the Rohirrim in times of crisis. One place that was identified was Dunharrow, above the valley of Harrowdale. On one such venture, Brago was accompanied by his eldest son, Baldur, and they discovered an ominous door, the Dark Door that led to the paths of the dead. At the door was an old man, who gave a chilling warning to the duo. The way is shut, and it was made by those who were dead. The old man belonged to the last living remnants of the Men of the Mountains, the betrayers who had been cursed by Isildur thousands of years earlier. The old man then promptly died. Unbeknownst to both father and son, this moment would lead to tragedy. In 2569, Meduseld was completed, and Brago arranged for a massive feast. A feast where Baldur, perhaps filled with liquid courage, would vow to walk the paths of the dead. The next year, Baldur would follow through on his vow and ventured beyond the Dark Door, never to be seen again. We learn almost 500 years later that Baldur was likely attacked by some of the men who still lived there. His legs were broken and he would die alone in the darkness, clawing helplessly at a closed door. An awful way to go. Brago would soon follow, dying of grief at the loss of his eldest son. He was only 58. So far, longevity was not the strong suit of the Kings of Rohan. Fortunately, Brago had two other sons, Aldor, born in 2544, and Eofor, of whom nothing is known about, except that he was an ancestor of Eamund, the father of Eomer and Eowyn. When Aldor took the throne, Rohan itself was still a very young kingdom, only now 60 years old. And in that time, they had fought conflicts against the Easterlings and the Dunlendings, and had had two kings and a prince die untimely deaths. Rohan needed stability, and Aldor provided that. During his reign, the Rohirrim would begin to increase exponentially. always finding new valleys to settle in the White Mountains. One such valley was the previously mentioned Harrowdale beneath Dunharrow. Aldor would also complete the works of his father, the subjugation or expulsion of the Dunlendings in Rohan's west, and he would take it a step further, even raiding the lands of the Dunlendings in Enedwaith. Apparently, this was done for revenge, indicating that the feud between the two peoples had grown deadly indeed. His methods, whether they were just or unjust, were effective, and for the first time in Rohan's short history, it had peace on both its western and eastern frontiers. But the Dunlendings would not forget, and they would not forgive, and it was not long before they were back on the offensive. Aldor's reign is seen as one of the most prosperous periods in Rohan's history, and the length of the reign itself was legendary. Thanks to the premature death of his father, Aldor had only been 26 when he took the throne, and when he died in 2645, he was 101 years old, having ruled Rohan for 75 years. Contrary to his grandfather Eorl the Young, who Aldor never actually met, Aldor would be known as Aldor the Old. Fun fact, Aldor is the only king of Rohan that cracked 100 years. Aldor had 3 daughters, all unnamed, but his 4th child was a son, Freya, born in 2570, the same year Aldor began his legendary reign. Thanks to the long reign of his father, Freya was already 75 years old when he took the throne. He was kind of like Charles, whereas Aldor was like Elizabeth. Considering his age, Freya still had a decent run, ruling for 14 years before dying at the age of 89 in 2659. Unfortunately, thanks to Aldor's prosperous reign, nothing of note really happens during the reigns of Freya and the next few kings. One thing we do know, however, is that the Dunlendings did notice the death of Aldor, who they must have both feared and hated, and soon afterwards they began drifting back towards Rohan. Some began to settle in the mountain glens east and west of Isengard, and some of the bolder ones even began to settle in the southern eaves of the Fangorn. At this time, the Rohirrim didn't really take notice of them. They rarely ventured to Isengard or to Fangorn, believing both to be places of dark magic. At this point in time, Isengard was still held by a Gondorian garrison. Once again, imagine air quotes when I say Gondorian. Freya was followed by Freyawain, whose reign is also unremarkable. Fun fact about Freyawain, he was the first king of Rohan to actually have a relationship with his father. We don't know about the status of Eorl's grandfather. Leod died before Brago was born, Eorl was killed 1 year after Aldor was born, and Freya was born on the same year Brago died. Thanks to Aldor living such a long life, Freya was a middle-aged man of 51 upon Aldor's death. Also, Freya's son and grandson, Goldwine and Dior, also got to meet Aldor. 5 generations of the same family alive at the same time. That's quite an achievement. There is one little thing to note about Freyawain. Future troublemaker and powerful lord in the Westmarch, Freka, claimed to be a descendant of Freyawain. We're unsure about the truthfulness of these claims. Freyawain only had one known son, but he may have had others and even daughters. Still, if Freka's claim is true, it means that some of Freyawain's descendants ended up mingling with Dunlendings, given that Freka was allegedly half Dunlending. Freyawain ruled only a little longer than his father, dying in 2680, aged 86, having ruled Rohan for 21 years. His son, Goldwine, followed in a similarly unremarkable fashion, dying in 2699, aged 80, having only ruled for 19 years. Goldwine's son, Daor, came to the throne a little younger than his most recent forebearers, becoming king at the age of 55. This turned out to be fortunate for the Rohirrim, for in Daor's time, Rohan's peace would come to an end, and it would need a more vigorous king. Earlier, I mentioned that Dunlendings had been quietly drifting back to Rohan's borders, and in some cases even taking up residence in Rohan's territory. For about 60 years, they kept to themselves, but with the coming of the 28th century, they turned hostile and began to raid the Westfold, as if they were sleeper agents waiting to be activated. Of chief concern to the Rohirrim was where these raids were actually originating from. You see, the only known place the Isen could be easily crossed were at the fords of Isen, where the Rohirrim kept a permanent guard, and the Rohirrim quickly discovered that the Dunlendings were not crossing the river anywhere far to the south of Isengard. So in 2710, Daor led an expedition northwards towards Isengard, intent on figuring out what was going on. On the way, he encountered an army of Dunlendings. Nothing is known about this battle, but we know that Daor came out on top. At first, Daor believed that the Dunlendings had been besieging the Gondorian garrison in Isengard, but when he sent messengers to the gates to inform them that the danger had been passed, the defenders shot at them. It then became clear that Isengard was no longer in Gondorian hands, and was now controlled by the Dunlendings, and it was this control of Isengard that was allowing them to get across the Isen into Rohan undetected. It was later learned that over time, the Gondorian garrison, isolated and forgotten, had been mixing with the Dunlending peoples that had taken up residence in the valley, and as Gondor waned and Isengard was seemingly forgotten by the stewards, the loyalties of the garrison began to shift. They were no longer concerned with Gondor and began to identify more with the Dunlendings, thus they didn't really take kindly to the Rohirrim. Still, when the Rohirrim arrived, Isengard was still technically loyal to Gondor, as it was ruled by a hereditary line of chieftains that had seemingly avoided mixing with the other locals, but they soon died out, and command fell to those who were much more aligned with the Dunlendings. Sometime during, or shortly before the reign of Daor, a group of Dunlendings were admitted to Isengard as friends and then seized it by force, killing any of those in the garrison who were still loyal to Gondor. Thus, Isengard had fallen to the Dunlendings in silence, and both the King of Rohan and the Steward of Gondor were none the wiser. Daor and his Rohirrim, more suited to open battles in the plains rather than siege warfare, were unable to do anything about the Dunlendings in Isengard. He sent word to Steward Egalamoth in Gondor, but likewise Egalamoth was unable to send forces north as there were renewed assaults coming from Mordor. His expedition having yielded mixed results, Daor retreated back into Rohan, and alongside the warriors who defended the fords, a strong force of riders was kept in the north of the Westfold to intercept any raiders that had crossed the river at Isengard. Nevertheless, Daor's actions had bloodied the noses of the Dunlendings. After all, he had defeated an army of them, and now had a strategy to successfully counter their raids. Rohan was safe, at least for now. The rest of his reign is marked as uneventful, and he would die in 2718, aged 74, having also ruled for 19 years. His son Gram would succeed him, and although there are no specific events during his reign, it can be assumed that warfare with the Dunlendings did continue. He would die in 2741, aged 73, having ruled for 23 years. He had two known children, the younger a daughter named Hild, but the eldest is a well-known name, Helm, who would go on to be known as Helm Hammerhand. When Helm became king, he was a man of 50, still renowned for his strength, with 3 children, 2 sons, Halef and Hama, and an unnamed daughter. In Helm's reign, he faced a rather unique problem that, as far as we know, none of the early kings of Rohan had yet faced, and that problem was the West March, Rohan's oft-forgotten 7th region. Unlike the rest of Rohan, the West March was east of the Misty Mountains and the White Mountains, enterable through a narrow strip of land between the River Isen and the White Mountains. Thanks to this relative geographic isolation, the West March developed differently to the rest of Rohan. Here, it was quite common for Rohirrim settlers and the Dunlendings, who lived just on the other side of the Isen and the Adorn, to mix. This mixing led to a man named Freka. I mentioned Freka once earlier. He was a man who claimed descent from King Freowine, but it was evident that he had a great deal of Dunlending blood in him as he was dark-haired, uncommon in Rohan. In the West March, Freka had grown rich and powerful. Although he was technically a vassal of Helm's, he had wide lands on the other side of the River Adorn, not part of Rohan's territory, and he treated the West March as his personal fiefdom, building a fortress at the source of the Adorn, and rarely attending council meetings in Rohan. He had a large amount of loyal followers, both Rohirrim and Dunlending, especially those of mixed descent. Helm, for obvious reasons, did not trust him. In 2754, 13 years into Helm's reign, Freka actually attended one of Helm's councils, but when Freka attended, it was because he wanted something, and this time he wanted something big, asking for Helm's daughter to marry his son, Wulf. Helm responded with this: "You have grown big since you were last here, but it is mostly fat, I guess." Freka flew into a rage, insulted the king, and eventually threatened him. Helm laughed this off and simply stated that they could talk after the council meeting was over. Sure enough, they did talk after the meeting was over, outside Eotheod in a field, alone, just the two of them. You can imagine there was quite a bit of tension, and Freka's men were aware of it, but Helm did not allow them to attend this private meeting. All they could do was comply because they were heavily outnumbered. In reality, this wasn't really a meeting, it was a reckoning, perhaps from all the years of disloyalty. Helm had a problem, and he was going to deal with it once and for all. At least, so he thought. Now, Dunlanding, you have only Helm to deal with, alone and unarmed. But you have said much already, and it is my turn to speak. Freka, your folly has grown with your belly. You talk of a staff. If Helm dislikes a crooked staff that is thrust onto him, he breaks it. So. And then Helm punched Freka so hard that it killed him. Hammerhand indeed. Whether Helm intended on killing Freka is unknown. You'd have to think so. If you have a disloyal vassal, punching him in the face won't solve the problem, but killing him might. But it didn't. Regardless, Helm quickly doubled down on his actions. He declared Wolf and all of Freka's close kin as traitors. He then dispatched a great deal of riders into the West March to enforce those orders and to ensure the loyalty of any of Freka's former subjects. Of course, this didn't solve the problem. As I said earlier, Freka had power on both sides of the Adorn, power in lands that were beyond Helm's control, and unless Helm intended on launching a full-scale invasion of Dunland, Freka's family could continue to plot and build their power for revenge. But as history had shown, Dunland could not stand against Rohan alone. They would need allies or an opportunity, or perhaps both. This came in 2758, 4 years after the death of Freka. After leaving Rohan alone for 2 centuries, the Easterlings returned, invading Rohan from across the Anduin. This was seemingly a coordinated assault, as at the same time, 3 fleets of Corsairs attacked Gondor, and there was fighting all along Gondor's coastlines. But what happened next was probably not coordinated. Some of the Corsairs sailed up the Isen and the Lefnui, and ended up allying themselves to the Dunlendings. This was truly an alliance that nobody could have expected. It's unlikely that these two people even knew about each other, and if they did, it seems nigh impossible that they were able to send and receive messages. Perhaps the Corsairs were intending on raiding Rohan, ran into the Dunlendings along the way, who proposed they attack together. Whatever happened, it does seem like bad luck. Rohan's bad luck. Helm seems to have been dealing with the Easterling invasion, but when the Dunlendings invaded, he rushed west to fight them. At the fords of Isen, Helm was defeated, and driven back with heavy losses. Although the Rohirrim had defeated the Dunlendings in the past, they were not only facing Dunlendings, but also Corsairs, mixed fighters from the West March, and possibly Rohirrim defectors too, and the Dunlendings were led by Wolf, a man who had technically grown up in Rohan and knew its strengths and weaknesses. Unable to give battle again, Helm retreated into the Hornburg, where he was soon cut off and besieged. He did not know the fate of the rest of Rohan, and it's probably better that he didn't. Attacked from the east and west, and with no army left to defend it, Rohan was overrun. Many fled into the mountain dales, where they could be safe for a time, such as Dunharrow, but those that didn't were either killed or enslaved, just like the Northmen of the Second Age, just like the men of Rhovanion. Wolf attacked and captured Eotheod, taking up his seat in Meduseld. The final defender was Haleth, Helm's heir, who fell before the doors. With Gondor preoccupied with the Corsairs, it seemed that Rohan was finished, the Northmen defeated once again. The cycle of history was brutal indeed. But just when Wolf and his Dunlendings seemed secure in their victory, Rohan was conquered by a new foe, winter. In November of 2958, the long winter began, and it would blanket Rohan in snow for almost 5 months. Already ravaged by war, Rohan was now ravaged by famine, and many starved to death. But it wasn't only the Rohirrim who suffered. The winter paralysed the invading Dunlendings and Easterlings, and they could not complete their conquest by taking the valleys where many of the Rohirrim still held out. They also began to starve, not just in Rohan, but also in places like Dunland and Isengard. In the Hornburg, supplies began to dwindle after December, and hunger began to rack the survivors. Against Helm's advice, Harma, his youngest son, led a sortie from the keep in an attempt to find food, but they disappeared in the snows and were never seen again. Now Helm, still a large powerful man at 68, began to grow gaunt from famine and grief, his presence became terrifying for the Dunlendings. He would dress in white and stalk their frozen camps, slaying enemies with his bare hands. The Dunlendings believed that Helm would eat the corpses of those he killed, and whenever he blew his horn, signalling that he was coming out to fight, many of them would flee down the valley until he left. This, however, would not last. One night, in perhaps late February or early March, Helm set forth from the Hornburg, but he did not return. The next morning, he was found frozen upon the dike, standing upright with his knees unbent. Although perhaps minimal in physical gains, and perhaps heavily exaggerated, the legend of Helm Hammerhand would persist. For the Dunlendings, he would be a terrifying wraith who would stalk and eat his foes. For the Rohirrim, he was a symbol of defiance, and from that point on, the Hornburg would commonly be referred to as Helm's Deep. The winter broke shortly afterwards, and although it had devastated Rohan, it had halted the momentum of its invaders and severely weakened them as well. But if the Rohirrim wanted their country back, they would need a little bit of luck and a lot of courage. With Helm and both his sons dead, Freylaf Hildason became the de facto leader of Rohan. He was the son of Hild, Helm's sister, and by this time he was a man of 33 with a young son of his own. In a daring attack, he led a band of desperate men to Edoras, still held by Wulf. They snuck in, slew him, and managed to recapture the town. The Dunlendings were thrown into disarray at the loss of their leader, but the Easterlings still had to be dealt with. Fortunately for Rohan, nature was on their side. The Easterlings had waited out the winter by camping along the banks of the Entwash. But the Entwash ran through a valley, and when the snows melted, this valley became flooded. The camps of the Easterlings were inundated, and those that didn't perish in the floods were forced to retreat from Rohan, their invasion effectively over. Shortly afterwards, help from Gondor arrived. In the south, Beregond, the son of the elderly steward Beren, was a great captain of men, and he had defeated the Corsairs. Now he sent help to Rohan, from both the east and west, and over the course of 2959, the Dunlendings were once again driven from Rohan. But this was not enough. Dunland still had something that belonged to Gondor, and a combined force led by Freylaf marched to Isengard and besieged it. The Dunlendings who lived there had already suffered during the long winter, and thus it did not take long for them to surrender. However, not all of Rohan could be retaken. The West March, the place where all of these troubles first began, remained in the hands of the Dunlendings, or at the very least, in the hands of mixed Rohirrim who were allied or sympathetic to them. Evidently, Freylaf did not have the resources to conquer and hold it. As devastating as the long winter was, it must be said that it played a massive role in Rohan's survival. Although I doubt it was on the minds of those Rohirrim who froze or starved, the reality is that the winter effectively halted the invasion and weakened the invaders enough for Rohan to counterattack after the snows had passed. And the winter gave time for Gondor to vanquish the Corsairs, meaning that when spring arrived, they were in position to immediately send help north. If the winter had not been so potent, it's probable that there wouldn't have been a Rohan left to save, and the kingdom would have been divided between the Easterlings and the Dunlendings, a catastrophic result for the Rohirrim and for Gondor. After Rohan's enemies had been defeated, Freylaf was crowned king, as he was Helm's closest living male relative. He would preside over a much weaker realm than his predecessor. The number of Rohirrim had been greatly reduced, as had their horses and cattle. One might suspect that it was similar to the aftermath of the Great Plague, where 50% of the population perished. At Freylaf's coronation, there was a certain guest present who would play a major role in things to come: Saruman the White. Saruman had spent much of the Third Age in the East, his actions and whereabouts unknown, but for the last few centuries he had dwelt as a guest in Gondor. At the coronation, he sung the praises of the Rohirrim and honoured them with gifts. Shortly afterwards, it seems that Saruman offered to take Isengard as his abode. This offer was eagerly accepted by Steward Beren and King Freylaf. After all, Isengard was still technically a Gondorian possession, but was now without a Gondorian garrison. The presence of Saruman there would, in theory, both protect Isengard from foreign invaders, and in the mind of Beren, allow him to more easily provide aid to Rohan, which would need it in the years to come. Obviously, we have the power of knowing how things turned out, but at the time, it seems Saruman didn't have any nefarious purposes. with the possible exception of wanting to get his hands on the Orthanc stone, the Palantir, which he surely knew about. Regardless, he was given the keys to Orthanc and proved a helpful ally throughout the rest of Freylaf's realm. As for Freylaf, he ruled for 39 years, dying in 2798, aged 72, the shortest lived of Rohan's kings to die naturally. He is considered the first king of the second line of Rohan, as he was the first king of Rohan to not succeed his father. Fortunately for Rohan, the traumatic events that took place decades earlier did not repeat, and Freylaf was succeeded by his son, Britta, who would quickly earn the name of Britta Leofa, or Britta the Beloved. Britta earned this name for his generosity, a trait that he had inherited from his father. It had been 4 decades since the Long Winter, not so far removed that it had faded from living memory, or the scars it had left behind had been healed. Britta was faced with the task of continuing to mend his kingdom, but during his reign a new threat emerged. Perhaps not as deadly as the Dunlendings, but still one that could have major consequences. In the final years of Freylaf's reign, the War of the Dwarves and Orcs had been raging throughout the Misty Mountains. In the first year of Britta's reign, the decisive Battle of Azanul Bazaar took place outside the gates of Moria, a costly victory for the Dwarves. The ramifications were that many Orcs attempted to flee the Misty Mountains, and a decent number of them struck out southwards towards the White Mountains, which as far as we know, had remained Orc-free for most, if not all, of its existence. Fleeing bands of Orcs wouldn't normally be a major threat, but Rohan was still weak, and should these Orcs have succeeded in making new homes in the White Mountains, they could end up a major problem for the Rohirrim in the future, many of whom dwelt in the valleys of the White Mountains. Fortunately, Britta found great success in fighting the Orcs off, and by the time his reign came to an end, it was believed the threat had passed and the White Mountains were once again Orc-free. Britta had a long reign. He himself lived to be 90, and due to the fact that his father had died relatively young, he ended up reigning for a lengthy 44 years, dying in 2842. He was succeeded by his son, Walder, who, like several kings of Rohan before him, came to the throne relatively late in life. He was 62 when Britta died. Not much is known about Walder. He never really got a chance to prove himself, not because he was already advancing in years, but because the assumption that the White Mountains were Orc-free turned out to be fatally false. In 2851, a mere 9 years into his reign, Walder and a group of companions left Dunharrow. The reason for their presence there or their destination is unknown, but we do know what happened next. While taking a mountain path, they were trapped by Orcs and slain to the last man. Walder was 71 years of age at the time of his death. This brought Folker to the throne of Rohan. Before becoming king, Folker was known as a mighty hunter, but the slaying of his father enraged him to the point of where he vowed that he would hunt no wild beast again until there were absolutely no Orcs left in Rohan. Having now realized that their assumption was wrong, Folker led the Rohirrim on a campaign of extermination against the remaining Orcs in the White Mountains. This was no easy task. Orcs are good at hiding, and mountains provide plenty of hiding places. But by 2864, the Rohirrim were certain they had destroyed the last Orc hold in the mountains, and history would prove it to be true this time. Having completed his vow, and having avenged his father, Folker immediately set off to hunt the great boar of Everholt in the woods of Firienholt. At this point, Folker was 60 years of age, and had not hunted in over a decade, but this did not dissuade him from hunting such a mighty beast. But perhaps it should have. Although Folker did succeed in slaying the boar, he received a mortal wound from the beast's tusks. He died shortly afterwards, having ruled for just 13 years. With the untimely death of his father, Folkwine became the king of Rohan aged just 34. When he became king, it had been over 100 years since the Long Winter, and few, if any, living memories of those days still remained. Rohan had now recovered its strength, and it said that in the days of Folkwine, the king could call upon 100 Aereds if need be, or 12,000 fully armed riders of Rohan. Folkwine put this strength to good use. The West March, having been independent since the Long Winter, was finally reconquered by Rohan during his reign. Although the loyalties of the people who lived there were still quite dubious, many of them looked fondly upon the legacy of Freka. Although Folkwine's reign saw the return of prosperity and power for the Rohirrim, it was not without tragedy, especially for Folkwine himself. In 2885, 21 years into his rule, he learned that a large army of Haradrim was planning on attacking Gondor. The Rohirrim were still eternally grateful for Gondor's help after the long winter, so Fulkwyne was intent on dispatching an army south to aid Gondor in its battles. Fulkwyne initially planned on leading this expeditionary force himself, but was talked out of it by his advisors, perhaps realizing that Rohan did not need yet another short-reigned king. In his stead were sent Fulkred and Fastred, his twin sons aged 27. Neither Fulkred or Fastred would return. Although Gondor was victorious, the twin brothers were slain in battle, side by side, while fighting in Ithilien. They were buried in a mound at the crossings of the Poros, a mound that would be known as Hald in Gwanur, or the Mound of the Twins. Steward Turin II would send Fulkwyne a rich Wergilden gold to compensate for his tragic losses. It's unknown how Fulkwyne reacted to the news, but at the very least, he handled it better than his ancestor Brago. He would go on to live for another 18 years, dying in 2903, aged 73, having ruled for 39 years. Neither Fulkred or Fastred had children of their own, so skipping Fulkwyne's unnamed daughter, the throne would then pass to Fengel, Fulkwyne's youngest son. It's worth noting that when his elder brothers died, Fengel was just a lad of 15, and with Fulkwyne unlikely to have any more children, it can be speculated that Fengel became even more important to him, and was subsequently spoiled. The reason for this is that Fengel is rare amongst the kings of Rohan for not being remembered fondly. His most prominent characteristics were said to be his greed, of both food and gold. It was said that he was often at strife with his marshals. If this wasn't bad enough, Fengel wasn't just disliked by his subjects, but also his own children, of which he had at least 3, 2 daughters and a son, named Thengel. That's Thengel with a TH, but to avoid confusing anyone, because I do struggle to pronounce the TH sound, I'm just going to call them Senior and Junior until one exits the story. Now, Senior seems to have been so quarrelsome that when Junior reached adulthood, presumably around 29-25, he actually left Rohan entirely and instead lived in Gondor where he served under Steward Turgon. That's pretty bad when your only son and heir wants absolutely nothing to do with you and is willing to leave the country to make that a reality. Unfortunately for the rest of the Rohirrim who did not have that luxury, Senior would prove to be a lengthy ruler, and when he died aged 83 in 2953, he had ruled for a massive 50 years. Junior would be recalled to Rohan, and he would accept reluctantly, I might add, and would succeed his father. Thengel, I'll go back to calling him that as his father has now departed the story, brought some unique quirks upon his return to Rohan. Firstly, he brought back a wife. Yes, no king of Rohan had had a wife at this point. No, I'm only joking. But the difference with Thengel's wife was that she was Gondorian, Morwen Steelsheen, who he had met in Lossarnach. Morwen, however, was not native to Lossarnach and was of Númenorian descent, her family having come from Dol Amroth, evident by her dark hair and her height. Second, Thengel brought back 2 children. Theoden, yes, that Theoden. He was born in Gondor and spent his first 5 years there, and an unnamed daughter as well. 3 more daughters were born after their return to Rohan, the youngest of these being Theodwyn, the mother of Eomer and Eowyn. And lastly, after spending at least 25 years in Gondor, Thengel returned with a fluency in Sindarin, a first amongst Rohan's kings, and along with Westron, these would be the daily languages in Rohan's court. The native language of Rohan was gradually phased out. By the way, because I haven't mentioned it earlier, did you know that the native language of Rohan was known as Rohanese? It was revealed in the Nature of Middle-earth. Before that, most people had called the language Rohirric, a non-canon word, but a word that sounds like it fits. For me, Rohanese still sounds kind of odd, and I often try to avoid using it, but whether I like it or not, it's canon. Anyway, back to the story. It's also worth noting that Thengel married and sired children unusually late in life for a king of Rohan. Morwen was 17 years his younger, and he did not marry her until he was 38. Theoden was not born until he was 43, and he was 58 upon the birth of Theodwyn. So by the time Theoden reached manhood, Thengel was already advancing in years. Also, another fun fact, or maybe sad fact, because Thengel only returned to Rohan after his father died, Theoden never met his grandfather. This made him the third king of Rohan in a row to not meet his grandfather, as both Thangel and Fengel never met theirs. Spoiler alert, future king of Rohan, Eomer, also never met his ruling grandfather, as Thangel died 11 years before he was born. A far cry from the days of Uldor, when 5 kings would live at the same time. Unfortunately, Thangel's reign would see Rohan slowly beginning to slide back towards war. In Isengard, Saruman had long been plotting to get his hands on the One Ring, but had outwardly remained a friend and ally of the Free Peoples. But in 2953, the same year Thangel ascended to the throne, Saruman would isolate himself in Isengard, and would begin to fortify it, at first with the help of Dunlendings, and later with the help of Orcs. Although he did not openly make war against the Rohirrim, it soon became clear to them that he was becoming overly friendly with Rohan's enemies, namely the Dunlendings, and was providing them with help in their own attacks against Rohan. In the east, Sauron had also returned to Mordor 2 years prior, and his servants became far more active. Presumably, Rohan would have faced raids from the east as well, from both Orcs and possibly Easterlings. Thangel did have help though. This came in the form of a mysterious man from the north, only known as Thorongil. He would ride at Thangel's side during his unnamed battles. Unfortunately, Thorongil's deeds in Rohan are mostly unknown, and soon afterwards he would leave for Gondor and serve beneath Steward Ecthelion II. Unknown to the Rohirrim, Thorongil was Aragorn, Isildur's heir, and when he returned to Rohan over 60 years later, few would remember him given the difference in how Aragorn aged from normal men. Thangel would die in 2980, reaching the age of 75, and having ruled for 27 years, thus ascended to the throne Theoden Ednew, Theoden the Horsemaster, Theoden King. He came to the throne at the young age of 32 on account of his father having kids later than usual. The death of his father was not the first personal tragedy Theoden had to overcome. 2 years earlier, his wife Elfhild had died in childbirth while delivering what would be Theoden's only son, Theodred. Theoden was also especially close to his younger sister, Theodwyn, who was 15 years his younger. Theodwyn would marry a man named Eomund, who was a descendant of Eofor, the third son of Brago, the second king of Rohan. Together, they would have 2 children, Eomer, born in 2991, and Eowyn, born in 2995. Unfortunately, this union would also result in tragedy. Eomund was a high-ranking officer in Rohan's military, possibly one of the 3 marshals of the Riddermark. During these times, it was common for orcs to raid across the Anduin, especially targeting Rohan's horse herds, which would be delivered back to Mordor and used there. In 3002, Eomund was pursuing a large band of orc raiders to the east wall of Rohan, across the river from Emyn Muil. There, he was ambushed by an even larger force and killed. Theodwyn quickly became ill, possibly due to grief, and died shortly afterwards, leaving Eomer and Eowyn, still children, without parents. Theoden honoured the memory of his sister by adopting them as his own. At the midway point of Theoden's reign, Rohan had been at relative peace and was still quite powerful, as it was during King Folkwine's time. It was expected Rohan could raise at least 12,000 riders. There were also some very capable leaders that had emerged in Rohan during this time. The first and foremost was Theoden himself, who took a hands-on approach when it came to Rohan's military. Normally, there was a First Marshal of the Riddermark, who was in charge of the muster of Edoras and the surrounding land. But thanks to Theoden personally assuming this responsibility, no First Marshal was appointed during his time. Beneath him was a capable captain named Elfhelm, who usually commanded troops in Edoras itself. Then there was Prince Theodred, heir to the throne, a valiant man, and a capable fighter. He was the second Marshal of the Riddermark, and usually based himself out of Helm's Deep. Although Theodred commanded forces there, he was not the Lord of Helm's Deep. That honour belonged to a man named Erkenbrand, who Theoden said was almost like Helm Hammerhand reincarnated. Erkenbrand's lieutenant, Gamling, despite advancing in age, was also a capable warrior and tactician. Beneath Theodred were 2 other capable commanders, Grimbold of Grimslade, possibly its lord, and a man named Dunhir, Lord of Harrowdale and the nephew of Erkenbrand. And although young at the time, Eomer would soon prove himself to be a bit of a prodigy. He was quite tall, standing at around 6'6", Unusual for one of the Rohirrim, hot-headed, but a great warrior and commander all the same. Despite his youth, he was also widely respected. Like his father, he mostly lived in the Eastfold, and shortly before the War of the Ring, he was named Third Marshal of the Riddermark. His predecessor was unknown. It was these capable men who would step forward when Rohan found itself in dire straits. Around 3014, Theoden began to fall ill. It's possible that men believed it to be natural at first. After all, Theoden was now in his late 60s, but suspicion soon began to fall on Grima, Theoden's longtime advisor. As it turned out, at some point, Grima had been ensnared by Saruman, who himself had been ensnared by Sauron. Unknown to many, Saruman now had his sights set on conquering Rohan, and had been secretly building up his forces in Isengard. This was so well hidden that not even Gandalf realized it when he arrived in Isengard several years later. But Saruman recognized that if he was to stand any chance of conquering Rohan, he would first have to weaken it from the inside. And there was no better way than to neutralize the king, the main authority in the land. But why kill the king when you could mislead him and make him an unwitting asset? How Grima achieved this exactly is unknown. It's speculated that he was secretly administering poison to Theoden and took advantage of the king's weakened state by feeding him lies. These lies had two main purposes. One, to paint Saruman as a friend and loyal ally, even when he clearly wasn't, and two, to undermine the authority of those capable leaders in Rohan, mainly Eomer. Grima's most successful ploy was making it seem like Eomer wanted to be the heir to the throne, and while Theodred knew this was nonsense, Theoden did not. In doing this, Grima would ensure that Rohan was unprepared for war, and that its leaders were out of favour with the king. And war was not far away. By the middle of 3018, it became clear that the forces of darkness were preparing for an assault. In particular, when the Nazgul passed through Rohan in July, many people flee at their coming, and some of the refugees in as far away as Bree may have been Rohirrim. And at this time, Rohan was effectively paralysed. The king would only issue orders through Grima, and in reality, these orders were just from Grima, who had effectively taken control of the king. In September, after Gandalf escapes Isengard and reveals Saruman's treachery, it falls on deaf ears in Rohan's court. In the ever-problematic Westmarch, many of the warriors are siding with Saruman against Rohan, still bitter about Freka. Talk about holding onto a grudge. But by February in 3019, the threat had grown too great to ignore. Saruman had stopped trying to hide his treachery. Although Theoden forbid any military action, Theodred undermined his father's authority and began to muster forces in the Westfold. On the morning of the 25th, Theodred has gathered his forces, around 2,000 men, and has stationed them at the fords of Isen. A scout informs Theodred that Saruman's forces are mustering outside of Isengard, so Theodred decides to attack first, leading 1,100 mounted men. Saruman was predicting this. His forces rush to meet the Rohirrim, and although the vanguard is shattered, they had prepared defences to counter Rohan's mounted troops. Theodred's attack soon grinds to a halt, and looking east, Theodred realises his mistake. A long while back, I spoke of King Daor and how during his reign, Rohan was raided by Dunlendings, despite the fact the fords of Isen were constantly under guard. Daor rode north and realised that if an enemy held Isengard, they could come down both sides of the river, effectively rendering any defences at the fords as useless. 300 years later, and Theodred is about to relearn this. Looking east, he sees a company of Saruman's soldiers moving down the east bank of the river, and realizing that the garrison at the fords do not know this, he understands that he has to order a retreat lest he get cut off. By the time Theodred reaches the fords, the day is almost over. But the battle is only just beginning. Before Theodred has time to properly organize his defenses, Saruman's eastern force arrives unexpectedly quick. It's not a large force, but it consists of Dunlending horsemen, Orcish wolf riders, and 2 battalions of heavy-armed Uruks. Rohan's eastern garrison fights desperately, but is mostly swept away, and just as this happens, Isengard's western force arrives, attacking Rohan's western garrison, which is being led by Grimbold. The moment the Isengarders gain the eastern shore, a company of heavily armed men and half-orcs appear, and charges directly at Theodred, who is commanding the battle from a small island in the middle of the ford. Grimbold takes some of his men, and rushes to the prince's aid, but it's too late, and Theodred is cut down. At that point, the Rohirrim at the fords would have been utterly destroyed if not for the timely arrival of Elfhelm, leading a force of 500 riders. Elfhelm had been in Edoras, but had decided to answer the prince's summons against the king's orders. He was not expecting battle for several days, and had planned on staying the night at Helm's Deep, but had decided to continue towards the forts when his scouts spotted 2 wolf riders. Those 2 wolf riders really screwed up, because Elfhelm's arrival turns the battle. Most of the Isengarders flee, those caught in the middle of the fords are slain to the last man. It's then discovered that Theodred is still alive, but only for a few moments longer. His final words are, "Let me lie here to keep the fords till Eomer comes." He was 41 years old and had no children of his own. Despite their heavy losses, the Rohirrim stayed at the ford through the cold and sleepless night, expecting an attack the following morning. But morning brought no attack, and instead groups of surviving Rohirrim began to trickle back to the fords, many telling tales that their pursuers had suddenly and unexpectedly retreated. It later became clear that Saruman's forces had only one objective for the battle: kill Theodred. That they had achieved, and with the Crown Prince dead, it was expected that all resistance in Rohan would collapse. And to be fair to Saruman, this would have been the case had Isengard immediately attacked again. This battle took place on the 25th, and by the time a messenger reached Edoras on the 27th, Eomer had already left to hunt the orcs that had just attacked the Fellowship of the Ring at Pathgallen. The message would instead reach Theoden's deaf ears, and as per usual, Grima would promise caution, in a time where caution should be thrown to the wind. There would be no mustering of Rohan, and there would be no reinforcements for the Westfold. And when Eomer does return to Edoras on the 30th, he is jailed for going against the king's orders. There is no mustering of Rohan's forces, and the men in the Westfold are on their own. But by the 30th, Saruman still has not attacked again. Why he did not attack is unknown. Saruman's actions had been quite reckless up until this point, but at the one moment Saruman needed to be bold, he was cautious, and that cost him dearly. In the Westfold, Erkenbrand has assumed overall command, but he is at Helm's Deep for the moment, so command in the field is given to Grimbold. But Grimbold does not assume command over Elfhelm and his riders, as they are from the King's Land, not the Westfold, proving just how convoluted Rohan's chain of command is at this point. And the 2 men disagree about what the best course of action is. Elfhelm wants to abandon the fords entirely as they serve no strategic purpose, considering Isengard's forces can come down both sides of the river. He wants to withdraw northwards along the eastern bank, deploy the footmen as bait, and then ambush Isengard's army with his cavalry and drive them into the river. Grimbold, however, still wants to hold the fords. It's Westfold military tradition to not abandon the fords, but there are some practical reasons too. He believes that if they abandon the fords, Isengard's forces will simply come down the western side of the river, rendering Elfhelm's plan as useless. He also believes that Saruman will still want to take the fords regardless of what the Rohirrim do. It's the faster way to Isengard, and leaving enemy forces between you and your supply line is a terrible idea. At the very least, Grimbold's forces could delay Isengard's army. In the end, both commanders adopt their own plans. Grimbold deploys most of his forces, probably numbering no more than 1,000, on the west bank of the river, trusting Elfhelm to hold the east. Elfhelm deploys his 500 cavalry a bit away from the fords, ready to act as mobile reserves if need be. At noon on the 2nd of March, a force from Isengard assaults Grimbold's positions on the western bank. Grimbold's soldiers hold valiantly and inflict heavy casualties upon the Isengarders, but by around sunset they are driven across to the eastern bank. Meanwhile, Elfhelm is waiting for an attack from the eastern side of the river, but that attack does not come, so he withdraws to his camp around nightfall. Both men send their own messages to Erkenbrand, warning that the fall of the fords are imminent. Erkenbrand's position at this point is unknown. He isn't at Helm's Deep, but he never arrives at the fords, so it's speculated that he may have been hurrying west with reinforcements, but didn't arrive in time and was forced to flee into the southern hills to avoid being overtaken by Saruman's army. Shortly after nightfall, the Isen turns into a river of flame as thousands of Isengarders march down the west bank, brandishing torches. Realizing how outnumbered he is, Grimbold abandons the fords and retreats to his own camp, where he orders his men to form a shield wall. They do this, and they are soon surrounded by Isengard's forces, but the Isengarders cannot break the shield wall no matter how hard they try. Grimbold is initially waiting for Elfhelm to arrive, but eventually realizes help isn't coming. Realizing that they are doomed unless they try something desperate, Grimbold orders the shield wall to open long enough for 60 riders, led by Dunhere, to break out. These riders circle around, split in two, and then hit the flanks of the Isengarders, who momentarily panic, thinking the relief force has arrived, giving Grimbold's remaining soldiers enough time to escape. So why didn't Elfhelm come and help? Well, Elfhelm was right about Isengard sending most of its army down the eastern bank of the river. The western force was just a distraction. The only problem is that this army didn't move until nightfall, and moved without any sources of light, meaning that Elfhelm never saw them coming, and a vanguard of wolf riders manages to sneak past, putting themselves between Grimbold and Elfhelm's camps. Elfhelm chooses not to attack them, correctly guessing that this is a vanguard of a much larger army, and that his riders will get caught if they engage. This leaves Elfhelm facing a difficult decision. He knows Grimbold is in trouble, but if he rushes to his aid, then both their forces might get caught and destroyed. But if he retreats, then at least his own men will live to fight another day, but he must live with the guilt and shame of abandoning Grimbold. Elfhelm chooses the latter, and fortunately for him, it turns out to be the correct decision, as Grimbold and many of his men also escape. Despite this heroic delaying action, Isengard is victorious yet again, and now holds the fords. The way into the Westfold and the rest of Rohan is now completely open to them, and with the Westfold's forces scattered, it seems like there will be no one left to stop them. But Saruman choosing to delay his invasion has proven costly. On the morning of the 2nd, Gandalf arrives in Edoras and heals Theoden of his afflictions, and Grima is revealed as a traitor. Theoden realizes that he must act immediately if he is to save his kingdom, so he orders a muster of Edoras, and by late afternoon, he has gathered around 1,000 riders. He frees Eomer and names him his new heir, and leaves Edoras in the hands of Eowyn at the behest of Harma, his loyal captain of the guard. Theoden's army rides west for 5 hours and camps on the open plains. Theoden's plan is to reinforce the fords, but little does he know, the fords have already fallen. This is confirmed shortly before they arrive at the fork in the road that leads to Helm's Deep. A survivor from the fords named Eorl reaches the king's company and informs them that the fords have fallen. Notably, Eorl believes that this force is being led by Eomer, as he assumes that the king is still sick, and he is overjoyed to find that Theoden actually leads it. At this moment, Gandalf departs from the group, stating that he has business to attend to, but advises Theoden to seek the refuge of Helm's Deep and bolster the garrison there, and not try and face Isengard in open battle. After all, he only has 1,000 riders with him, and his intel on enemy troop numbers and movements is severely limited. Theoden makes for Helm's Deep, and already he sees some of the carnage that has unfolded. There are a lot of memes about the Westfold falling, but it truly was a horrific event. Ahead of the main army, Isengard's commander unleashed roving bands of orcs and riders, with the sole purpose of hunting down stragglers that were unable to defend themselves. Even as Theoden's force is approaching the Deeping Combe, they see bodies littering the roads and fields, and the raiders responsible refuse to give battle, fleeing at the approach of the Rohirrim, denying them a chance at vengeance. Although it's said that 3/4 of the folk of the Westfold managed to make it to the Helm's Deep, many of those that didn't were killed, and given the Westfold was one of the most populated areas of Rohan, this meant that thousands, if not tens of thousands, were slaughtered by Isengard's forces, and many towns, villages and homesteads were burnt to the ground. In the end, Theoden makes it to the Hornburg with mere hours to spare. Even as they're entering the fortress, Isengard's vast army is spilling into the valley behind them. At Helm's Deep, Theoden discovers that Erkenbrand is missing, along with many of his best men. He left behind a garrison of 1,000 men, led by Gamling the Old, but many of these warriors are either too young or too old. Still, with a garrison of 2,000, Helm's Deep is a mighty bastion, one that Isengard cannot afford to leave behind its lines. I've done a lengthy video on the Battle of the Hornburg, so I'll spare a lot of the minor details here. At midnight, the battle begins, with the first Isengarders reaching the earthen wall known as Helm's Dyke. Here, a rearguard led by Gamling peppers them with arrows before retreating to the main fortress. Rain begins to pour, and lightning begins to flash as the Isengarders reach the Hornburg itself. The rain and poor visibility do not help the defenders, and many of their arrows miss their marks. The first attack comes against the gate on the main causeway, and although it is blunted several times, 2 battering rams manned by the strongest Dunlendings and supported by a company of orc archers eventually make it to the top. This attempt is only thwarted when Aragorn and Eomer lead a sortie from a postern gate, but even this only temporarily stops the attack. Shortly afterwards, the assault against the main wall commences with the help of hundreds of ladders and grappling ropes. This is a costly experiment for the Isengarders, but they outnumber the Rohirrim by at least 5 to 1, so they're slowly winning a battle of attrition. On 3 separate occasions, they manage to gain a major foothold on the walls, only for Eomer and Aragorn to heroically lead counterattacks that drive them back again. But the Isengarders are not just trying to go over the wall. Some of these smaller orcs manage to sneak through a culvert beneath the wall, and only attack when the fighting on the wall is at its heaviest. This cunning attack would have broken the defences, if not for Gamling leading a company of reserves down from the keep to drive it back. Unfortunately for the defenders, it's about to get worse. After these attacks fail, the Isengarders unleash a new weapon, only known as blasting fire. Whatever it is, it has a devastating effect, ripping a hole in the wall large enough for the attackers to swarm in. The defense of the wall swiftly crumbles, and the defenders are either driven back into the Hornburg itself, or are driven towards the glittering caves. In his chambers, Theoden is despondent, believing that the battle is now well and truly lost, and to be fair to him, the situation is looking grim. Although direct assaults upon the walls of the Hornburg fail, the Isengarders manage to use more blasting fire to destroy the main gates. But just as all seems lost, a horn blast echoes from the hills, and moments later another comes from the tower of the Hornburg, the legendary Horn of Helm Hammerhand. As the first rays of the sun bathe the fortress, King Theoden, alongside Aragorn and a company of riders, issue forth from the Hornburg and down the causeway. They are joined by the remaining defenders of the Hornburg, and shortly afterwards, those Rohirrim driven into the glittering caves also sally forth. Unprepared for the sudden onslaught and concerned about the horn blasts from the surrounding hills, the Isengarders panic and begin to flee over Helm's Dyke. They do not find salvation awaiting them. The once empty field beyond the dike is now a foreboding wall of trees, Huorns from Fangorn Forest. This breaks what little remaining cohesion they have left, and they attempt to flee into the hills. But the source of the horn blasts are finally revealed. Gandalf, joined by Erkenbrand and 1,000 men on foot, pour down into the valley from the western ridge. These men are survivors from the Fords of Isen, or Erkenbrand's men, who were rallied by Gandalf over the previous night. Only minutes ago, it seemed like Isengard was on the verge of victory, and now they were experiencing a crushing defeat. The Dunlendings surrendered and were later forced to help repair the damage to the Hornburg. The orcs were slaughtered or fled into the forests, where they were dealt with by the Huorns, and just like that, the battle was over. Unknown to those present at Helm's Deep, Saruman's war machine had already been dealt a crippling blow on the 2nd of March, the night before the battle. That night, the Ents had marched on Isengard, destroyed it, and now had Saruman stuck in the Tower of Orthanc. The defeat of his army at Helm's Deep was merely the final nail in the coffin, and Isengard's participation in the War of the Ring was now at an end. Although the Westfold had been devastated by Saruman's invasion, it must be said that the war between Isengard and Rohan wasn't as costly to Rohan as one might think. Although we do not have the exact numbers, Rohan's military dead across both battles at the Fords of Isen and the Battle of the Hornburg was at an absolute maximum around 3,000, but more likely in between 1,500 to 2,000. Those dead included Prince Theodred and Hama, Theoden's loyal door warden. But with the exception of the warriors from Edoras, almost all of the fighting had been done by the men of the Westfold, and Rohan's other regions had yet to be properly mustered. This was important because although the first phase of the War of the Ring was now over, the second, far more brutal phase was about to begin. On the 5th of March, Theoden, Eomer, and a company of Rohirrim, as well as Gandalf, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, arrive at Isengard to parley with Saruman. There isn't really much to say about the parley. Saruman attempts to use the power of his voice to persuade the Rohirrim that he isn't their enemy, despite everything he has done. This time, Theoden is having none of it, and Saruman resorts to insults. He makes one last desperate attempt to convince Gandalf, but that too fails, and the ensuing argument results in Saruman losing his Palantir, courtesy of Grima Wormtongue. On the return to Rohan, Pippin ends up using said Palantir, which alerts Sauron to his presence. Sauron believes that Pippin is the halfling with the One Ring, and that he is in Saruman's possession. Gandalf decides to set off towards Minas Tirith with Pippin immediately, and later stops at Edoras, where he informs the Rohirrim of Theoden's victory at Helm's Deep, and tells them to begin the mustering of all of Rohan's forces. Due to the presence of the Nazgul atop their fell beasts, Gandalf suggests that the riders gather at Harrowdale, beneath the feet of the White Mountains, where they cannot be so easily scouted. As for the others, they are overtaken by the Grey Company, 30 rangers from the north, along with Elladan and Elrohir, the sons of Elrond. This larger company now returns to Helm's Deep, and it's there Aragorn informs Theoden and Éomer that they must part ways. He will take the Paths of the Dead into Gondor. As for the Rohirrim at Helm's Deep, Theoden is only going to leave a small garrison at the Hornburg, trusting that no more threats shall come from the west. He is correct in this, as the remnants of Saruman's forces that either escape Isengard or the Hornburg are systematically destroyed in Druath Eotheod by the Druidine. 1,000 riders have already been sent towards Harrowdale, and another 500 more are going to ride with the king. They are planning on taking the mountain paths. I actually don't know why they do this, as it's much slower than the direct road to Edoras. Fortunately, the mustering the Rohirrim takes place at Harrowdale, and by the time Theoden arrives on the 9th, much of Rohan's forces have already been mustered. That night, 2 riders from Gondor arrive at Dunharrow. One of them is Hiragon, who is bearing the Red Arrow, the token that the Gondorians use to summon the Rohirrim to war. Hiragon pleads for Rohan's aid as soon as possible, and while Theoden is glad to give it, he also points out that there will be some difficulties. Firstly, he states that he must leave some defenders at home, as he is concerned that Sauron might attack Rohan while he is away. As a result, although he believes he could set forth with as many as 10,000 riders, he does not want to leave with any more than 6,000. And secondly, he believes it may take as long as a week to get to Minas Tirith. Hiragon is grateful for the help, but believes that Minas Tirith will have probably fallen by then. The morning of the following day, the 10th, is the Dawnless Day, which indicates Sauron is ready to begin his assault. Sure enough, this is the day that the Morgul host sets forth, while another small army sets forth from the Black Gate. Theoden now decides that the Rohirrim must leave immediately, and cannot wait any longer for more riders to arrive. They must also travel openly and lightly, with only enough supplies to last them until they reach the battlefield. Hiragon and his companion leave first, while Theoden and Éomer organise their forces. In the end, Theoden has 5,500 heavily armed riders, as well as several hundred other lightly armed riders who are bringing along the spare horses. In command of the army is Theoden himself, and Éomer is his second in command. The 2 other senior commanders are Grimbold and Elfhelm. Before the Rohirrim leave, Theoden orders that Merry will stay in Rohan with Éowyn and help her govern, much to Merry's disappointment. However, when the Rohirrim leave, Merry is allowed to ride with a rider named Dernhelm, who is actually Éowyn in disguise. They are part of Elfhelm's company, and there seems to be an understanding between Dernhelm and Elfhelm, suggesting that Elfhelm might be aware that Éowyn and Merry are part of his company. The army camps to the east of Edoras on the night of the 10th. The following day, as the Rohirrim are nearing their eastern borders, they encounter lone riders fleeing from the north, bearing bad news. As Theoden feared, eastern Rohan is being invaded from across the Anduin, and companies of orcs are already marching through the Wold. The Wold is sparsely populated, so little damage is being done at the moment, but with the bulk of Rohan's forces about to leave, these orcs will seemingly have free rein to do what they want. Nevertheless, Éomer orders the men onwards. Unknown to them, and fortunately for those Rohirrim that remained at home, these orcish invaders will run into Ents the following day and will get completely destroyed. On the 13th, the Rohirrim are camped in the eaves of the Druidan forest, and here they run into their first obstacle. Anticipating that the Rohirrim will come to Gondor's aid, Sauron commanded an army to capture Caer Andros, and then march forth into Anorion and block the road to Minas Tirith. This army is well prepared for the Rohirrim, and have dug trenches and placed sharpened stakes along the road. Theoden is well aware that he cannot simply sweep this army aside, and has thus ordered a halt to their advance, a halt that Minas Tirith cannot afford. By now, the Pelennor fields have been overrun, and the city is surrounded. Enter an unlikely hero, Garnburry Garn. Garn is one of the Druidine, remnants of an ancient people who once dwelt through much of the lands of Rohan and Gondor. By the end of the Third Age, they have been reduced to enclaves, one such as the Druidan Forest. Garn presents himself to the Rohirrim, and reinforces the fact that they cannot fight Sauron's forces that are dug in along the road. He says that the Rohirrim are outnumbered, and even if they do win, how many will be left to help Gondor? Theoden sees the wisdom in this. Thus, Garn has a proposal. He will lead the Rohirrim down a hidden path called the Stone Wain Valley. Although progress will be slower, it will allow the Rohirrim to bypass Sauron's forces and the road, and emerge just north of Minas Tirith, where Sauron's forces will not be expecting them. In return, he only wishes that the Rohirrim will stop hunting the Druidine. Evidently, this has happened in the past, and it's not exclusive to the Rohirrim. We know that the pre-Númenóreans, from which the Dunlendings were descended, hunted them as well. Through most of the 14th, the Rohirrim are led through the Stone Wain Valley, and by the time they emerge into the open fields once again, it is nearing dawn of the 15th. Here they encounter some mixed news. The good news is discovered by Garn just before he leaves. The orcs besieging Minas Tirith have not set patrols who watch the northern approach, believing that their flank is protected by their forces in Anórien. Provided the Rohirrim move quickly, they will have the jump on the Morgul host. The bad news is that Elfhelm's scouts discover the bodies of Hiragon and his companion, and it's clear that they never made it back to Minas Tirith. The Gondorians do not know the Rohirrim are coming. Nearing the smouldering ruins of the walls of the Rammas Acor that surrounds the Pelennor, Theoden arrays his order of battle. He will lead the vanguard, and Éomer will follow him down the centre. Elfhelm will form the right flank after they pass the wall, and Grimbold shall form the left flank. The plan is fairly simple. Pure aggression. The Rohirrim will smash into the flanks of the Morgul host, and will then ruthlessly attack them wherever they attempt to gather. Any orcs that milled around the walls were quickly killed, and the Rohirrim managed to pass onto the Pelennor without the alarm being raised. It's here where Theoden gives his iconic speech, which I will not be able to do justice. Arise, arise, riders of Theoden, fell deeds awake, fire and slaughter, spear shall be shaken, shield be splintered, a sword day, a red day, ere the sun rises, ride now, ride to Gondor. This speech is given at the exact moment the Witch King breaks the gates of Minas Tirith, and he turns around in alarm when he hears the horns of the Rohirrim. The Battle of Pelennor Fields is about to be joined. Like several of the other battles throughout Rohan's history, I've also covered the Battle of Pelennor Fields in depth in my War in Middle-earth series. The first phase of the battle goes splendidly for the Rohirrim. The northern half of the Morgul host is smashed to pieces. The Rohirrim break into the siege camps, slaughtering this way and that. Their first major challenge comes in the form of the Haradrim. Their leader, known only as the Black Serpent, raises his own banner and his horsemen engage the Rohirrim. The Haradrim have the numbers, but the Rohirrim have the fury, and Theoden himself slays the Black Serpent with his spear and then cuts down the standard and its bearer. With this, the Haradrim cavalry routs from the field. But just as Theoden is celebrating his victory, tragedy strikes. The Witch King swoops down on him from atop his fell beast, causing Snowmane, Theoden's horse, to rear up. At that exact moment, Snowmane is struck by a dart and collapses, crushing Theoden underneath. Before the Witch King can do any more damage, he is confronted by Éowyn, and in a short yet historic duel, Éowyn manages to slay the Witch King with the help of Merry. Although not without damage to herself, she is afflicted by the Black Breath and has her arm broken. Theoden lives long enough for Éomer to arrive at the scene, and hails him as the new king before he succumbs to his injuries. Theoden is the first king of Rohan to die a violent death since Folka in 2864, and only the third to be slain in battle. Éomer then notices Éowyn, and believing that she is dead, he falls into a rage and leads the Rohirrim in a deadly charge towards the south, determined to completely break the Morgul host and their allied Haradrim. At this point, reinforcements are filtering in for both sides. Gondorians are sallying forth from Minas Tirith, led by Prince Imrahil, and Gothmog, the new commander of the Morgul host, is summoning new forces from across the river. Deadly though it may be, Éomer's ferocious charge has left him in a precarious position. He's now cut off in the southern part of the Pelennor Fields, and he now sees the black sails of the Corsair fleet approaching Harlond, a small port just to the south of Minas Tirith. Believing that he is doomed, he rallies his remaining fighters atop a small hill and prepares to make a shield wall, but just as he is raising his sword in defiance towards them, a banner on the lead ship suddenly unfurls, a white tree with 7 stars and a crown above it, the standard of Elendil. Aragorn, after braving the paths of the dead, has arrived. The arrival of Aragorn and the several thousand Gondorians he leads is enough to change the course of the battle. Now beset on three sides, the Morgul host begins to splinter and break, with many of the orcs fleeing towards the river. The Haradrim and the Easterlings are far harder to break, and although the result of the battle isn't in doubt, they doggedly resist throughout the day, resulting in heavy casualties on both sides. The battle finally ends at dusk, when the last pockets of resistance are snuffed out. We don't know the exact losses for the battle, except for the Rohirrim, and these losses are heavy. Of the 6,000 riders, 2,000 are killed during the battle, as are many of the horses. There are also some notable names amongst the dead. First and foremost is obviously Theoden King, but many of his best knights died defending him. Deowain, the commander of the King's Guard, Guflaf, the banner carrier, and other knights such as Harding, Herefara, Herubrand, Horn, and Fastred. Another huge loss is Grimbold of Grimslade, hero of the Fords of Isen and commander of the army's left flank. Dunhir, Lord of Harrowdale, nephew of Erkenbrand, and another hero of the Fords of Isen, was also killed in the fighting. Eomer has scarcely any time to rest before he must represent Rohan as its new king. The following day, the last debate is held outside of Minas Tirith, where the remaining captains of the West must figure out their next moves. In the end, it is decided that an army will march on Mordor, to draw Sauron's attention to help aid the ring-bearer, Frodo Baggins. An army of 7,000 is gathered for the venture, but Rohan's forces only make up 1,000 of that number, 500 of Eomer's best riders, and another 500 men on foot who have been unhorsed. As for the other 3,000 Rohirrim who survived the battle, they will have another important task. The blocking force in Anorion must be destroyed. This task is given to Elfhelm. On the 18th, the host of the West sets forth from Minas Tirith. This same day, Elfhelm's 3,000 riders destroy Mordor's forces in Anorion. After hearing of the defeat at the Pelennor, this force was already hurriedly retreating towards Caer Andros, and when Elfhelm hits them, they shatter and flee. As for the host of the West, they march north through Ithilien, only facing resistance on the 21st, when a force of Easterlings and Orcs attempt to ambush them. This ambush fails catastrophically. The Rangers of Ithilien spot it early, and Aragorn uses his cavalry to outflank and destroy them, cavalry that no doubt includes Eomer's riders. But not all of the Rohirrim in the host of the West are fit for such a task as attacking Mordor. On the 23rd, as the host reaches Dagorlad, about 1,000 men refuse to go any further, a large number of these men being either farmers from Lossarnach in Gondor or from the Westfold in Rohan. Aragorn sends these men to retake Caer Andros from the enemy, and although we know nothing of that battle, we do know that they are successful. So by the time the host of the West reaches the Black Gate on the 24th, it has a little under 6,000 men, and only about 1/10 of them are actually Rohirrim. The following day, the 25th, the Battle of the Morannon begins. Aragorn splits his army into two, both defending large slag hills. He personally commands on one hill, and Eomer and Imrahil command from the other. The fighting is brutal, the host of the West is surrounded and fighting for their lives, but despite all their valor, they are horrifically outnumbered and are quickly being squeezed to death. But just as everything seems lost, a miracle occurs. In Samathnawa, Gollum slips and falls into the fires of Mount Doom, clutching the One Ring. Its destruction causes the destruction of Sauron. His creations crumble, and his armies begin to shatter and flee. A few choose to fight to the death, but like at the Pelennor, the result is not in doubt. Sauron is defeated, and the West is victorious. Some of the Rohirrim and the Gondorians make their way into the north of Mordor to secure the area and destroy any remnants of Sauron's forces and fortresses. But most of them, including Eomer, return to Gondor and make camp at the Field of Cormallen in Ithilien. For at least several weeks, they remain there in celebration, but on the 1st of May, Eomer is in Minas Tirith to attend the coronation of Aragorn. A week later, Eomer and Aragorn, King Elessar, renew the 500-year-old Oath of Eorl, and the following day, Eomer and Eowyn return to Rohan. Eomer is not there long. On the 18th of July, he returns to Minas Tirith and leads an escort bearing Theoden's body back to Rohan. Theoden's funeral takes place on the 10th of August. At the funeral, the betrothal of Eowyn and Faramir is announced, and Merry is honoured by Eomer for his efforts, and is given the Horn of the Mark as a reward, a famous heirloom. Eomer's reign brought a lot of changes for Rohan. One of the biggest changes was to the military's command structure. Eomer had no doubt seen how the previous system had some major flaws. The title of First Marshal was completely removed, and the titles of Second and Third Marshal were replaced with Marshal of the Westmark, given to Erkenbrand, and Marshal of the Eastmark, given to Elfhelm. The Marshal of the Westmark had military authority over the Westfold, the Westmarch, and the West Emnant, and the Marshal of the Eastmark had military authority over the Wold, the East Emnant, and the Eastfold. These were static titles that had their own chains of command and were not beholden to each other at any time, unlike before where the Third Marshal was beneath the Second Marshal. The King had military authority over the central region of the Fold and still had overall command, but to prevent a Theoden-like situation happening again, the title of Underking was created. During a time of war, the Underking had two roles: to rule the realm in the king's absence, or to take command in the field should the king stay at home for any reason. During peace, the position of Underking was only filled if the king was sick or if old age had rendered them unfit to rule. In most occasions, the Underking would be the heir to the throne, provided he was of age. However, if the king only had one son, then they would not be sent into battle as the Underking, and instead someone else would have to be chosen. And for the first time since Rohan's founding, its borders actually expanded. It's worth noting that this only appears in some versions of the text. During Eomer's reign, the Rohirrim multiplied, entering their most prosperous period since the reign of King Folkwyne. As a result, they claimed new lands. In the north, the empty lands between the River Limelight and Lothlorien were settled. These lands had never been claimed by any other kingdom before, and Rohirrim settlers even began to cross the Isen and settle in the wide lands of Enedwaith, formerly controlled, at least nominally, by their Dunlanding enemies. Speaking of them, we're unsure of how these relations went, but one could assume that they slowly warmed. Just as the Rohirrim settled new lands, they received new settlers of a different kind. Enamoured by his brief stay in the glittering caves behind the Hornburg, Gimli establishes a dwarven colony there. We don't know much else about it. The beginning of the Fourth Age was largely a time of peace and prosperity, but war was not entirely left behind. Although many of Sauron's former servants were keen to make peace with Rohan and the new polity of the reunited kingdom, some were not so eager and had to be suppressed. During the reigns of Eomer and Elessar, the forces of Gondor and Rohan would go far and wide. Whether it be the deserts of Harad or the plains of Rhûn, the green banner of Rohan could be seen, and the thundering hooves of its horses could be heard. Eomer himself would come to be known as Eomer Eodig, or Eomer the Blessed, due to the prosperity of his reign. In 3021, the final year of the Third Age, he would marry Lothiriel, Princess of Dol Amroth and daughter of Prince Imrahil. Shortly into the Fourth Age, they would have a son known as Elfwine the Fair. Due to coming to the throne at the young age of 28, Eomer would have a lengthy reign, 65 years, the longest of any king of Rohan except for Uldor the Old. In 63 of the Fourth Age, Eomer felt his death approaching and sent a message to Merry in the Shire, asking him to visit one final time. Merry, along with his friend Pippin, would come and stayed with Eomer until his death in the autumn of that year. He was 93 years old. Unfortunately, Rohan's history does not extend any further than that. Elfwine would become king in that year and was probably already close to the age of 60. The names of his children and their reigns are not recorded, nor is anything else that happened to Rohan afterwards. But one can probably assume that as long as the reunited kingdom stood, Rohan probably stood beside it, and if the heirs of Elessar were said to have ruled for 100 generations after him, then perhaps the heirs of Eomer did the same. But one thing is for sure, the world is changed, and Rohan is no more. I want to thank you for listening if you made it this far. I know the audio isn't as crisp as a usual podcast. Unfortunately, I don't have access to a studio or expensive equipment. If you've seen any of my live streams, you know I record this in a garage. And I want to apologize if the pace in which I spoke changed. Normally, I'm trying to speak sort of quickly without becoming unintelligible, so consciously slowing down is something I had to get used to. And I did actually record this over 4 different sessions because it ended up being so long. So sometimes I kind of came in and was like, okay, I'm keeping it slow, I know what I'm doing. And then other times I'd come in and just forget. So I apologize for that too. If you want more of these types of videos, please let me know, and feel free to suggest or vote up a comment that has already made that suggestion. Cheers, farewell, and if you ever watch videos like this that are really lengthy in the future, make sure you get up and stretch your legs.